The sky was still pale when the morning began. A soft golden light touched the tops of canvas tents, and a gentle breeze moved through the camp. The field hospital was quiet. Only the soft flutter of tent flaps and the distant call of early birds could be heard. Inside one of the long medical tents, a nurse slowly opened her eyes. Her name was Margaret. She lay on a simple cot, wrapped in a wool blanket. For a moment, she listened. The world around her was still asleep, or almost. Somewhere a kettle was starting to warm on a quiet fire. She sat up, slowly stretching her arms. Her back ached slightly from the hard bed, but she had grown used to it. She reached for her shawl, soft from many washings, and wrapped it gently around her shoulders. The air was cool, the kind of fresh morning chill that makes you breathe a little slower. As she stepped outside, the sunlight brushed her face with warmth. The sky was painted in soft oranges and pinks. A few other nurses were already awake, moving quietly, nodding to one another with peaceful smiles. No one spoke loudly. There was no need. The day had begun, and everyone knew what it would hold. Chatikvaid. Field Hospital was not a grand building. It was a group of canvas tents lined in neat rows. Each one had a wooden sign at the front: triage, supply, surgery, recovery. The paths between the tents were made of trampled dirt, and a few small stones marked the way. Margaret walked slowly toward the main tent, her boots crunching softly over the ground. Birds chirped in the trees at the edge of the camp. Their songs rose gently with the light of the sun. In the distance beyond the hills, the world was still waking up. In the main tent, a few nurses were already preparing for the morning. Bowls of warm water were being filled, clean cloths were folded and stacked. Bandages were set out in careful rows. Everything was quiet and calm. The hospital was not full of noise and panic, not in these early hours. There was only a soft rhythm, like the breathing of someone in deep sleep. Margaret picked up a clean towel and dipped it into one of the bowls. The water steamed slightly. She wrung it out gently and walked to the first bed. The soldier lying there was young, maybe no older than her youngest brother back home. His eyes were closed. His chest rose and fell slowly. She dabbed his forehead with the warm cloth, careful not to wake him. His skin was cool and his face looked peaceful in the soft morning light. She adjusted his blanket, tucking it under his arms, and then moved to the next bed. All around the tent, other nurses were doing the same. No one spoke. They worked like a quiet stream, moving, folding, rinsing, covering. A kind of silent harmony filled the space, as if they had done this not for weeks or months, but for years. Outside, the sun had risen a little higher. The canvas walls glowed with golden light. Shadows stretched softly across the ground. Somewhere, a gentle bell rang, not loud, just enough to signal that tea was ready. Margaret smiled and stepped out into the light. The camp kitchen was just a short walk away. A kettle steamed gently over the fire, and tin cups waited on a wooden table. She poured herself a cup and held it close, breathing in the warmth. The tea smelled faintly of mint. She sat on a small crate near the tent flap, sipping slowly. Another nurse sat beside her, a quiet girl named Elsie. They didn't speak. They just sat, warming their hands on their cups and watching the morning begin. In that stillness, Margaret thought of home. She pictured her mother's garden, the way the roses would open just like this, slow and soft under the same kind of sky. She imagined the clatter of dishes in the morning, the sound of her father's voice reading the paper, the scent of toast and jam. All of it felt so far away, and yet strangely close in that peaceful moment. Back inside, the hospital tent was filling with morning light. Some soldiers stirred gently in their beds. A few blinked open their eyes. One murmured softly in his sleep. A nurse gently touched his shoulder and whispered that everything was all right. The day would grow busier soon. More patients would arrive. There would be medicines to mix, wounds to clean, and new letters to read out loud. But for now, the hospital breathed slowly. The nurses moved gently. The world was not rushing. Margaret finished her tea, stood up, and brushed off her skirt. She walked back toward the tent, ready for whatever the day would bring. The light of the morning followed her, wrapping everything in quiet gold, and for just a little longer, the world felt soft. The sun had risen just a little higher now, casting a soft golden light across the field hospital. The gentle hum of morning continued, slow and unhurried. A breeze moved through the open flaps of the tents, bringing with it the fresh scent of damp grass and warm canvas. Inside the recovery tent, Margaret moved quietly. In her hands, she held a stack of folded sheets, crisp, clean, and still warm from the sun where they had dried the day before. She placed them gently on a wooden bench beside the cots. Around her, the other nurses moved like soft shadows, each one with a task, each one working without haste. There was no need to rush. The morning was quiet, and the soldiers still slept, soundly, wrapped in their dreams. Margaret picked up the first sheet. The fabric felt smooth under her fingers, and she held one corner carefully between her thumb and palm. With practiced ease, she shook it out once, a soft fluttering sound, and then began to tuck it neatly around the empty cot. The bed had been used just yesterday. The soldier who had rested there had been sent back behind the lines to a safer hospital. He had left a small note on the pillow, a simple thank you in careful handwriting. Margaret had folded the note and placed it in a tin box where she kept such things, small, quiet reminders of kindness. Now the bed stood empty, waiting for someone else who would need it soon. She moved around the corners, smoothing the sheet, tucking the edges in tight and flat. She puffed the pillow, gave it a small pat and laid it down right in the center. It looked peaceful, ready. At the far side of the tent, Elsie was doing the same. She hummed softly to herself, a little tune from home, something about bluebells and spring. Margaret didn't know the words, but the melody was sweet. It made the whole tent feel warmer, softer somehow. Outside, footsteps passed by, slow, steady. A medic carried a basket of clean bandages. Someone else rolled a barrel toward the wash station. Nothing felt loud. The camp breathed in a gentle rhythm. Back inside, Margaret picked up another sheet. This one smelled faintly of lavender. Someone must have tucked a few sprigs into the drying line again. She smiled. Little things like that mattered here. They made the hospital feel less like a place of pain and more like a place of care. She stretched the sheet across the next cot, pausing to smooth out a wrinkle. Her hands moved slowly and surely, as if folding sheets was the most important task in the world. And in that moment, it was. Every motion carried intention, every corner tucked with quiet love. One of the recovering soldiers stirred and opened his eyes. Margaret glanced his way and gave a small wave. He gave a sleepy nod in return and closed his eyes again. There was no need for words. Just being there, awake, alive and warm, was enough. Elsie brought over a small bundle of pillowcases and placed them beside Margaret. "These ones are from the warmest stack," she whispered with a smile. Margaret chuckled softly and nodded. Together they moved from cot to cot, folding and fluffing, their hands light and steady. Each bed, once made, looked like a tiny promise, a promise of rest, of healing, of something soft in a world that had grown so hard. As they worked, the light outside shifted. The sun began to climb, its rays stretching longer through the tent walls. The shadows moved slowly across the ground, like lazy ripples in a stream. A small breeze lifted the edge of a sheet, and Margaret caught it gently, laughing under her breath. The moment felt like something from childhood, like hanging laundry in the backyard, hearing the wind flap through the sheets and smelling the grass beneath her bare feet. For a second, she saw her mother's hands, folding linen on the old wooden table. She remembered the way her mother would smile and say, "Clean sheets mean a clean start." And here, even in this place, those words felt true. With each finished bed, the tent began to glow with order and peace. The straight lines of sheets, the soft pillows, the gentle folds, they were not just part of a task, they were part of the healing. In the far corner, one nurse lit a small oil lamp on the supply shelf. Its flame flickered slightly in the morning light, casting warm shadows that danced on the canvas walls, a little amber glow in a room full of pale sunlight. Margaret looked around. Every bed was ready. Every corner was smooth. The tent was quiet, again like a held breath. She sat on the edge of a cot and looked down the row of beds. So much care had gone into each one. No one would ever know exactly how much, the folding, the lifting, the smoothing, but the patients would feel it. They always did. Outside, the bell rang once, the soft tone that meant it was time for rounds to begin. Margaret stood slowly, brushing off her apron. She gave one last look at the peaceful tent, at the neat rows of waiting beds. All was ready. And so, with the calm of a quiet heart, she stepped out into the sunlight once more. The tents were quiet and the air felt cool and still. The early sunlight had turned golden now, slipping through the fabric walls and warming the ground in soft patches. The morning work of folding sheets and preparing beds was done. For a brief, treasured moment, the nurses had time to pause. Near the edge of the camp, under a canvas canopy, a small table had been set with a metal kettle and a stack of worn tin cups. The fire beneath the kettle crackled faintly, and a soft cloud of steam rose lazily into the sky. The scent of tea, something like mint, something like home, drifted gently through the air. Margaret stepped up to the table, holding her cup in both hands. The metal was cool at first, but soon warmed as the tea filled it. Steam curled upward in delicate spirals, vanishing into the breeze. She closed her eyes for a moment and breathed it in. The warmth, the stillness, the comfort. Around her, a few other nurses arrived, one by one with quiet footsteps on the dirt path. There was no rush, no loud greetings, just small nods, soft smiles, and the clink of tin cups as they were gently lifted and filled. Elsie sat down beside Margaret, cupping her tea and tucking her legs beneath her. She gave a sleepy little grin and whispered, "Best part of the day." Margaret smiled back. "Before everything starts." They sipped in silence for a while. The tea wasn't sweet. Sugar was rare now, but it was warm and steady, like a memory you could hold in your hands. The nurses sat on overturned crates and wooden stools, their shoulders relaxed, their eyes half-lidded in the calm. Far in the distance, a bird called once, twice, and then went quiet again. Someone laughed gently, not loud, just a soft chuckle, at something quietly said. Another nurse joined in, covering her mouth with her hand, careful not to disturb the morning peace. It felt good to laugh, even if just a little. In this place, such moments were rare and precious. The footsteps of a young orderly came slowly up the path. He carried a fresh kettle, steam trailing behind him like a ribbon. He set it down carefully, nodded to the group, and walked away without a word. His boots made a soft, rhythmic sound as he disappeared around the corner of a tent. Margaret watched him go. Her fingers curled gently around her cup. She noticed how everyone moved this morning, with thoughtfulness, with grace. Even tired limbs found a quiet rhythm here. There was something sacred in the slowness. She glanced toward the sky. A few clouds drifted lazily overhead. Nothing. Rushed. The world seemed to be in no hurry at all, and for now neither were they. A breeze lifted the edge of the canopy, fluttering the corners like a sleepy yawn. It touched Margaret's cheek, cool and soft, and carried with it the scent of wildflowers from somewhere beyond the trees. She thought of the hills behind her childhood home, how she and her sister would run barefoot through the grass, laughing and chasing butterflies. She could almost hear the echoes of those days in the quiet around her now. One of the nurses, an older woman named Clara, began humming a lullaby. It was something slow and low, with no real beginning or end. The sound drifted gently between the tents, blending with the hush of the wind and the bubbling kettle. No one spoke much. They didn't need to. The silence was not empty, it was full. Full of unspoken understanding, of shared mornings, of quiet care. Margaret poured herself a second cup. She held it for a moment before sipping, watching the way the steam danced above the rim. Time moved differently here, especially during tea. It stretched and slowed, wrapping the nurses in a moment that felt outside the war, outside the worry. A light bell rang once in the distance, soft like a whisper through the trees. It was the signal that the first round of the day would soon begin. The patients would start waking and the real work would return, but not quite yet. Elsie stood and stretched her arms gently. "One more sip," she said, finishing her tea. Margaret nodded and took her last drink too. The warmth lingered in her chest like a soft fire. One by one, the nurses placed their empty cups on the table. No one said goodbye. They simply smiled, small knowing smiles, and walked slowly back toward the tents. Their steps were light, their hearts a little fuller. Margaret walked last. Her boots brushed against the earth with a quiet rhythm. Birds fluttered nearby, and a few leaves danced in the breeze. Everything felt still, but not lifeless, as if the morning itself had been holding its breath. Inside the tent, the rows of beds waited calmly. The soldiers were beginning to stir. The sunlight now poured through the canvas, casting golden rectangles across the floor. It felt like stepping into a peaceful dream. Margaret tucked her shawl tighter around her shoulders and moved toward the first cot. The day had begun, and it had begun softly. The light inside the recovery tent had turned golden. It streamed softly through the canvas walls, painting warm stripes across the wooden floor and the folded blankets. The quiet hum of the camp lingered in the air. Not loud, just enough to remind the nurses that the world was slowly waking. Margaret stood by the wash basin, dipping a soft cloth into a bowl of warm water. Steam rose gently, curling into the morning air. She wrung the cloth carefully and folded it in her hands, moving slowly so it wouldn't drip on the floor. This was the first round of the day, the gentlest one. She walked to the first cot. The soldier lying there was asleep, his chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. His face was pale but peaceful, and one hand rested on his chest, fingers lightly curled. A book lay open beside him. Someone must have been reading to him last night. Margaret knelt beside the bed. Her movements were quiet, careful not to wake him. She placed the warm cloth gently across his forehead, letting the heat ease his... "Bro?" His eyelids fluttered for a moment but did not open. A soft sigh escaped his lips. He stayed asleep. She replaced the cloth with a fresh one, folded just right. Then she smoothed the blanket over him and stood up without a sound. One bed at a time. That was how the round would go. Each patient, each face, each breath. There was no rush. Time didn't feel fast here, it felt soft, like walking through mist. Elsie moved beside her, tending to the next bed. Their eyes met briefly and they nodded. No words were needed. They had done this many times. They knew each patient, each cot, each small sign of comfort or discomfort. At the far end of the tent, Clara whispered a greeting to a soldier who had just opened his eyes. Her voice was low and soothing, like a lullaby. "Good morning, dear. Just rest. You're safe." The soldier gave a faint smile and closed his eyes again. Margaret stepped to the next bed. A young man with a bandaged leg lay there, turned slightly toward the wall. His breathing was slow, but he winced softly in his sleep. She knelt and adjusted his pillow, then gently placed her hand on his shoulder, not to wake him, just to reassure. He settled again, the wrinkle in his forehead smoothing out. In the silence, there were sounds, but they were soft ones. The four. Dipping of cloth in water, the hush of footsteps on wood, the flutter of a canvas flap in the breeze. They blended together into something like a lullaby, something you didn't hear as much as feel. Margaret checked a small tray beside the bed. A note had been left by the night nurse. Fever improved, slept well, more tea water at noon. She smiled and tucked the note back under the teacup. There was something beautiful about this hour. The soldiers still resting, the nurses moving like feathers, the warmth of morning wrapping around everything like a shawl. At one cot, a small tin box sat beside the pillow. Inside, Margaret knew, were letters from home, folded carefully, smoothed again and again. The soldier hadn't been strong enough to write back yet, but he asked her to read the letters aloud sometimes. She would do that again later, when he was fully awake. For now, she simply adjusted the blanket and whispered, "Still here, safe and strong." She stepped back and let the silence fill in. A few birds chirped from a tree outside the tent. Their song floated through the canvas, high, light notes that made the tent feel more alive. Margaret moved to the next bed. This one had been empty. Yesterday, prepared carefully with clean sheets and a fresh pillow. Now a new patient lay there, sleeping deeply. His face was unfamiliar but peaceful. Someone had placed a photograph near his hand. a picture of two children standing in front of a small house. She looked at the photo for a moment, then smiled softly. Maybe they were his children, maybe siblings. She didn't know yet. But she made a quiet promise in her heart. He would be cared for gently and fully. She wet a fresh cloth, warmed it in her hands, and pressed it lightly to his cheeks. The skin was dry, and the cloth brought some relief. She whispered, "You're not alone," though she wasn't sure he could hear. Back and forth, cot to cot, the nurses continued their rounds. Some patients woke and blinked softly. Some stayed deep in sleep. All were cared for, no one hurried, no one made noise. It was like walking through a dream where everyone moved slowly, kindly, as if every motion was part of a bigger comfort. The time Margaret reached the last bed, the bowl of water had cooled. She wrung the cloth one last time and folded it neatly. The patient here was already awake, his eyes open and calm. He gave her a quiet nod as she approached. "Good morning," he whispered. She smiled gently. "Good morning. Did you rest?" He nodded again. "The pain's less today." She touched his hand softly. "That's good. We'll bring some tea soon." He closed his eyes again, not to sleep, but just to rest. Margaret stayed a moment longer, then turned and walked slowly back to the wash basin. Elsie joined her there, placing her own cloths into the laundry pail. "All calm?" she whispered. Margaret nodded. "Very calm." They stood for a moment in the stillness, letting the soft light fill the space around them. Outside, the breeze picked up again, and the tents whispered to one another. The first round was done, quiet, slow, and full of care, and the day continued, one gentle moment at a time. Later in the morning, when the light had settled softly inside the tents and the soldiers were resting once more, the nurses brought out paper, pencils, and quiet hearts. It was letter-writing hour, a time that didn't appear on any clock but was known by all. This was when the camp slowed even more, when voices lowered and pencils moved gently across the page. Some of the soldiers could write for themselves, but many could not. Some were too weak, their hands trembling from fever or pain. Others had injuries that kept them from holding a pen. For them, the nurses wrote. Margaret sat beside a young man whose eyes were closed, but who had spoken to her earlier about his mother's garden. His voice had been quiet, dreamy. He had described roses and chickens and a small wooden fence. Now he lay resting, his chest moving slowly under the blanket. She picked up a pencil, opened a small notebook, and whispered gently, "Shall we write to your mother today?" The young man opened his eyes, only halfway, and nodded softly. "All right," she said. "You just speak and I'll write for you." He took a slow breath. "Dear Mama," Margaret began, her handwriting neat and careful. "I hope this letter finds you well," he said, eyes still mostly closed. "I think about the house every day. I imagine the blue curtains in the kitchen and the creak of the back step." Margaret smiled faintly and wrote each word slowly. There was no hurry. She glanced up now and then to watch his face, making sure he was still comfortable. His voice came and went in quiet waves, pausing to remember, pausing to rest. "Tell Sarah I haven't forgotten her birthday," he said at last. "Even if I missed it this year." Margaret wrote that down, then added a small smiley face at the end, just as he had asked. By the time the letter was finished, his eyes had closed again, but his breathing was steady and peaceful. She placed the letter in a small envelope and wrote his family's name on the front. She would give it to the orderly later to post with the next outgoing mail. At the next cot, Elsie sat with another soldier, this one a bit older, with silver at his temples. His arm was bandaged and his voice was raspy, but his words were clear. "Start with my dearest wife," and he said. "She likes it when I call her that." Elsie nodded and smiled. "Of course." He spoke slowly, pausing often to remember the names of his grandchildren, the pattern of the tablecloth in their kitchen, and how the fireplace crackled when they sat beside it in winter. He stopped at one point, and his eyes grew a little misty. "Tell her not to worry too much," he said. "Say I'm in good hands." Elsie placed a hand gently on his, gave a small nod and kept writing. All around the tent, this quiet ritual continued. Paper rustled softly. Pencil tips scratched lightly over the page. No voices were loud, no movements rushed. It was like watching letters grow from the quiet soil of memory and love. At the corner of the tent, Clara helped a soldier compose a poem. He was shy about it, unsure of the words, but Clara encouraged him gently. She reminded him that even simple words could carry great meaning. He whispered lines about stars and the smell of apple pie, about missing laughter and dreaming of home. Clara wrote each one with a tender smile. Some letters were long, some short, some full of cheerful stories, some filled with quiet tears, but all of them mattered. All of them were threads that connected this still little hospital to the warm, waiting world far beyond the fields and the war. Margaret reached into a wooden box near the supply shelf. It held folded letters from home, replies that had already arrived. She read one to a soldier later that morning. His eyes filled with tears as he listened to his sister's words about school, their dog, and the new red bicycle she had bought with her own coins. When the letter was over, he asked Margaret to read it again, and she did. Softer the second, time slower, like a lullaby. Outside, the breeze moved through the trees, shaking a few early autumn leaves loose. One floated through the tent flap and landed gently on the floor. No one disturbed it. The nurses continued writing. One by one, the letters took shape, filled with the voices of men who longed for normal things, for morning coffee and newspapers, for the smell of warm bread, for children's laughter in the yard. And as the letters grew in number, so did the sense of peace in the tent. It was as if speaking of home made the hospital itself a little more like home, a little safer, a little softer. Later, the stack of finished envelopes would be tied with twine and handed to the courier. They would travel in the back of a truck, then on trains, and finally be placed in hands that trembled with joy and relief. But for now they rested in a neat pile on a quiet table, filled with love, hope, and the comfort of stillness. Margaret looked at her hands, faintly smudged with pencil lead, and smiled. This was more than just writing. This was healing too. The sun now shone gently above the tents, casting soft shadows along the edges of the paths. The light was not harsh. It filtered through the leaves and canvas like warm silk, touching everything with a golden calm. Inside the recovery tent, it was time for one of the nurses' kindest morning rituals, washing the faces of the sleeping and resting soldiers. Margaret stood at the wash station, quietly filling bowls with warm water. Steam rose in slow swirls, dancing in the still air. She tested the temperature with her wrist, then dipped a soft linen cloth into the warmth. The water carried the light scent of chamomile. Someone had dropped in a few crushed flowers earlier, just to make things a little more comforting. She smiled as she folded the cloth and placed it gently into a small basin. The cloth was worn, smooth from many washes, soft as a lullaby. Elsie joined her with a second bowl, balancing it carefully in both hands. "Still warm?" she whispered. Margaret nodded. "Perfect." They walked slowly down the row of cots, their steps quiet, and measured. Each soldier was still resting, some in deep sleep, others with eyes half open, watching the light drift across the canvas roof. Margaret stopped beside a young man with dark curls and sunken cheeks. His skin was pale, and a soft line of sweat touched his brow. She knelt beside him, dipped the cloth in the bowl again, and wrung it out until it was just damp, not dripping. Then, ever so gently, she began to wipe his face, across his forehead, down his cheeks, over his chin. Slow, smooth movements, like a mother washing her child after a long day. The soldier did not wake, but his breath deepened, and a little more color returned to his face. Margaret took her time, folding the cloth with each pass, always using the cleanest corner. She worked like someone folding prayers. Elsie was nearby, doing the same. She hummed a quiet tune, no words, just a simple melody that hung in the air like a soft thread. The soldiers didn't stir much, but the peacefulness of the moment settled over the tent like a comforting quilt. At another bed, Clara sat beside an older man who had not spoken in 2 days. She dabbed at his temples, careful not to touch the bruise along his hairline. His eyes fluttered slightly, and she whispered, "It's just warm water, love. You're safe." The man gave a faint sigh, almost like a whisper, and sank deeper into his pillow. The bowls were moved gently from bed to bed. The cloths were rinsed quietly and folded again. Every touch was light, every movement full of care. No one hurried. The nurses were not just cleaning faces, they were offering comfort, reminding these men that even here in a tent so far from home, someone would tend to them with kindness. Outside, a few birds sang from a nearby branch. Their notes drifted into the tent, blending with the soft rhythm of the nurses' steps. The smell of warm water and linen filled the air. Margaret moved to the next cot. This soldier had a letter tucked under his arm. It had arrived just the day before, and he hadn't let go of it since. She smiled as she brushed the damp cloth along his temples. "You can rest now," she whispered. "We'll keep watch," he murmured something, perhaps a name, then quieted again. At the far end of the tent, a nurse helped a soldier sit up slightly. He blinked and gave a tired smile as the warm cloth passed over his cheeks. "Reminds me of when I was little," he said softly. "My sister used to do this when I was sick." The nurse smiled. "Then she taught you well. We'll take care of you now." He leaned back into the pillows and let his eyes close again. Margaret paused to refresh her bowl. She walked slowly to the wash station, poured out the cool water, and filled the bowl again. The steam curled up around her fingers as she dipped a new cloth into it. Each small act, each bowl, each cloth, each touch, carried its own weight of care. They weren't grand gestures, but here they meant everything. The nurses didn't just see wounds and charts, they saw faces. Faces that belonged to someone, someone's son, someone's brother, someone's friend. They cleaned them, not just with water, but with warmth. By the time the last face had been washed, the bowls were empty, the cloths folded, and the tent glowed with a soft energy, like the peace that comes after a gentle rain. Margaret looked down the row of cots. The soldiers looked more comfortable now. Their skin was clean, their foreheads cool, their expressions calm. She felt a quiet fullness in her chest, the kind that comes not from doing something big, but from doing something small with great love. She gathered the cloths and placed them in the laundry basket. The sunlight touched her shoulders as she turned back toward the beds. Another small ritual complete, another quiet morning held in kindness. The sun had risen higher now, warm, but still gentle, casting long dappled shadows across the field hospital. The morning's tasks were done. Beds were made, faces were washed, letters had been written. And now there was a small, welcome pause in the day. Margaret stepped quietly outside the tent, stretching her arms as the soft breeze met her cheeks. The air smelled of distant pine, earth, and the faintest hint of wildflowers. A cluster of tall trees stood just beyond the edge of the hospital tents, their leaves fluttering like whispers in the light wind. She walked slowly toward them, her boots crunching softly on dry grass and scattered leaves. Each step felt light, like walking in a memory. There was no one else around for the moment, only the birds, the breeze, and the gentle hum of the camp in the background. She reached a large tree with low, broad branches and moss-covered roots. The shade beneath it was cool and comforting, and the ground felt soft. With a quiet sigh, Margaret sat down, folding her legs beneath her, her skirt brushing against the grass. Above her, the leaves danced in the wind, letting spots of sunlight flicker through like candlelight. She leaned back against the trunk, closed her eyes for a moment, and breathed deeply. No orders, no footsteps, no whispered names, just stillness. When she opened her eyes again, she watched the sky through the branches. Clouds drifted slowly. Overhead, big puffy ones that looked like mountains or soft pillows. She let her mind wander, like a child gazing from a bedroom window. One cloud looked like a teapot, another like a sailing ship. She smiled to herself. She thought of home, of the small garden behind her family's cottage, where mint grew along the fence and the wind always smelled fresh after a rain. She remembered her mother sitting on the porch steps, peeling apples with a small knife, handing her slices with a warm hand and a soft smile. Margaret hadn't seen her mother's face in over a year, but sometimes in quiet moments like this, she could feel her close. She could almost hear the creak of the old porch swing and the song of the wind chimes hanging near the kitchen window. She reached into the pocket of her apron and pulled out a folded piece of paper. A letter from home. The corners were worn now and the ink slightly faded. She didn't need to read it again. She already knew every word. "Your father is planting onions early this year," her mother had written. "The hens have stopped laying for now, but we think they'll start again come spring. I hung your blue dress in the wardrobe, just in case you make it home by summer." Margaret smiled at that. The letter didn't say much, but somehow it said everything. A squirrel rustled in the leaves above her, hopping from one branch to another, then leaping away out of sight. She watched it go, its tiny feet making no sound at all. Then her gaze drifted upward again, back to the sky, to the slow-moving clouds and the quiet blue beyond. Time didn't feel the same under the trees. It stretched and softened like warm cloth. She took off her cap and let the breeze brush her hair. It felt good, simple and kind, like being wrapped in a gentle lullaby. Voices sounded faintly in the distance, not calling, just talking. A few nurses had gathered near the supply tent, sharing a biscuit or two and a soft laugh. But Margaret stayed where she was, letting the quiet soak into her bones. She needed this, not sleep, but rest, a moment where nothing was expected, and the world could be still. A moment under the trees. She reached down and traced a finger across the moss beside her. It was soft and cool. Tiny wildflowers peeked out from the edge of the roots, yellow and blue and white, so small they looked like thoughts rather than flowers. A butterfly floated past her, its wings catching the sunlight. It danced in the air as if the world had no weight at all. She followed it with her eyes until it disappeared beyond the tents. Somewhere behind her, a kettle whistled. It would be time soon to return, to walk quietly among the cots again, to carry warm tea and soft cloths, to whisper comfort. But not yet. For now she was simply Margaret. Not just a nurse, not just a caretaker, but a daughter, a dreamer, someone sitting beneath a tree and thinking of home. The leaves rustled softly overhead. She leaned her head back against the trunk, closed her eyes, and let herself drift for just a little while. Not asleep, not awake, just somewhere peaceful in between. The afternoon light was beginning to soften as it poured through the edges of the tent. The golden hours had begun, that gentle part of the day when everything slowed down just a little more. Most of the soldiers were resting now, their breathing even, their dreams quiet. Margaret moved slowly down the row of cots, checking water cups, adjusting pillows, and brushing away the soft dust that sometimes drifted in from the outside path. At one cot near the back of the tent, a new patient had been admitted the night before. He was a quiet young man with sandy hair and freckles, barely 20. He hadn't spoken much, only nodded when nurses checked on him. His uniform had been folded neatly at the foot of his bed, and a small satchel rested beside it. Margaret paused beside him. He was awake now, eyes open but distant, gazing at nothing in particular. His hand moved slowly over the satchel, as if searching for something inside it by memory, not sight. "Would you like some tea?" she asked softly. He didn't answer, but his fingers stopped moving. Then, after a pause, he slowly pulled something. From the bag, a tiny dented object that fit in the palm of his hand. Margaret leaned closer. It was a music box. The lid was scratched, the metal worn down in places, but the little window on the side still moved. He held it out to her, eyes meeting hers for just a second, then looking away again. She took it gently, her fingers brushing his as she did. It was surprisingly light. She held it close to her chest for a moment, then sat down on a nearby stool. "May, she whispered. He nodded once. She turned the key, slowly, gently, and then let go. The music box began to play. The sound was faint at first, a tiny, tinny tune, cracked and wobbly from age and travel. A few of the notes skipped. A couple were slightly out of tune, but somehow that made it even more beautiful. It was a lullaby, something Margaret had heard long ago. She couldn't remember the name, but the melody floated back to her, wrapping itself around her like a soft scarf. She closed her eyes. She was no longer sitting in a hospital tent. She was 6 years old, curled up in a rocking chair while her mother hummed the same song. A fire crackled nearby. Her baby brother slept in a crib. Outside the window, snow had begun to fall. She opened her eyes again, blinking slowly, and looked down at the music box. The notes kept playing, quiet, gentle, patient. Across the tent, a few heads turned toward the sound. No one spoke. They just listened. Even the breeze outside seemed to pause. The soldier watched the box, his expression unreadable. Margaret wondered how many times he had played it before now, how many nights he had used it to fall asleep, how many miles it had traveled in his pocket, through mud, through fear, through quiet hopes whispered into the night. The tune slowed, one note at a time, and then fell silent. The box was still. No one moved right away. Then Margaret looked up and smiled. "That's a beautiful piece." The young man didn't answer, but his eyes softened. "Do you know where it's from?" she asked. He nodded, then whispered, "My sister gave it to me when I left." Margaret nodded. She turned the box over gently, inspecting the bottom where a few initials were carved. She couldn't read them fully, but the love behind them was clear. A child's careful hand, a quiet goodbye. "Would you like to hear it again?" she asked. He hesitated, then nodded once more. She wound the box again, slower this time, and the tune began again, just as soft, just as sweet. The music drifted up toward the ceiling of the tent, where the beams of sunlight still filtered in like golden ribbons. Dust motes danced slowly in the air, catching the light as if floating through water. One soldier, half asleep in the cot beside them, turned over with a smile. Another, who had been gazing out the tent flap, let his eyes fall closed, comforted by the melody. The music box played its quiet song until it slowed again, the final notes trailing off into silence. Margaret held it for a moment longer, then set it gently on the table beside the young soldier's bed. "Thank you for sharing that," she said. He looked at her, really looked this time, and gave the smallest, softest smile. "It helps me sleep," he murmured. She nodded. "It will help all of us." She rose and gave him one more look, before walking softly back toward the center of the tent. The hush returned, not because it had been broken, but because it had deepened. Sometimes healing didn't come from bandages or medicine. Sometimes it came from a tune, worn and quiet, that carried you gently home, if only in your heart. And in that peaceful tent, the air still hummed with its echo. The afternoon sun slanted low across the sky, casting a golden hue on the edges of the canvas tents. Shadows stretched long and soft over the quiet camp. Inside the recovery tent, all was calm. Most of the soldiers were resting. Some sat up against their pillows. Others stared quietly at the ceiling, their minds lost somewhere far away. Then came a gentle sound, the rolling wheels of a small wooden cart on the dirt path. Margaret looked up from the corner, where she had been folding clean towels. She knew that sound. So did the others. A young orderly appeared at the tent entrance, walking slowly, as if not to disturb the peace. He wore a soft smile, and in his arms was a bundle of envelopes tied neatly with twine. Letters. A few eyes lit up, a few backs straightened. No one spoke loudly, but a quiet hum of hope rippled through the room like a breeze across water. Margaret walked over and met the orderly near the front. He placed the bundle into her hands with care, nodded once and stepped back. His job was done. Now hers began. She untied the twine and carefully unfolded the bundle. The names on the envelopes were written in all kinds of handwriting. Some flowing and elegant, others childlike and clumsy. Each one was a thread that stretched across distance, across worry, across time. "Let's begin," she whispered to herself. She moved slowly from bed to bed, stopping beside each soldier. Some were already watching her with quiet anticipation. Others pretended not to notice, but she saw the flicker of hope in their eyes. "To Private Edwin Ross," she said softly, holding out the first letter. The young man in the third cot lifted his head. His hands trembled slightly as he reached. For the envelope, he didn't speak, just clutched it tightly to his chest. She moved on. To Corporal James H. Turner. A man with silver streaks in his beard sat up straighter. "From my wife?" he asked. Margaret smiled. "Looks like it." He nodded and took the letter gently. Holding it, as if it were made of glass. His eyes didn't leave the paper as she continued down the row. To Samuel Long, from a little girl named Lily. Samuel's lips quivered. "That's my daughter," he whispered. Margaret gave him the letter, and he turned it over and over in his hands, not yet opening it, just touching it, like it was the closest thing to home he'd had in months. Elsie joined Margaret with a second stack and began delivering on the far side of the tent. A few quiet thank yous were whispered. A few tears welled up, but no one sobbed. It wasn't that kind of moment. It was gentler than that. One soldier covered his eyes with his arm as he held his letter with the other. Another asked Margaret if she would read his aloud, as his vision hadn't fully returned. She pulled a chair close and unfolded the paper. "Dear Papa," she read softly, "I drew you a picture of our dog sitting in your chair. Mama says he sleeps there every night, waiting for you to come home." The soldier closed his eyes and listened, his lips moving silently with each word. When she finished, he smiled and asked her to read it once more. She did, this time even slower, letting each word land like a soft feather. Across the tent, some soldiers read silently, eyes scanning the pages again and again. Others held the envelopes against their hearts. Even those who received nothing that day still smiled, for the joy of their friends, for the feeling of being remembered, for the whisper of love that filled the room. Margaret noticed one soldier, watching quietly from his bed. His name was Henry, and he hadn't received a letter in many weeks. She walked over slowly and knelt beside him. "Still nothing today," she said softly. He gave a quiet shrug. "Maybe next time." Margaret reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "A nurse at the post office wrote this for the men who didn't get one. Would you like me to read it?" He blinked in surprise, then nodded. She opened the paper and began to read. "Dear soldier, we may not know your name or your town or your story, but we know you are brave and we are proud of you. Somewhere someone is thinking of you today. And until you hear from home, let this note remind you, you are not forgotten." Henry turned his face away for a moment. Then he whispered, "Thank you." Margaret folded the paper and left it on his table. By now, the light in the tent had softened even more. The sun outside had begun to slip behind the trees. The letters had all been handed out. Some had been read 3, even 4 times. Others were folded neatly under pillows to be kept close through the night. The quiet in the tent was different now, not heavy but full of memories, of familiar handwriting, of stories from kitchens and gardens and backyards, full of love. Margaret returned to her chair and sat for a moment, watching the soft movement of hands holding paper, eyes closing with emotion, hearts gently opened. The war felt far away for just a little while. Here, in the hush of the recovery tent, there were only letters and the warmth they carried, like sunlight through a window after a long, cold winter. The sun had begun its quiet descent, casting warm, golden light over the canvas tents and softening the corners of the world. In the calm that followed the letter delivery, there was a stillness in the air. Not silence, but peace. A gentle breath shared by the whole camp. Margaret stood at the edge of the field hospital with a small basket hanging from her arm. Inside it lay handfuls of wildflowers, delicate, cheerful and fresh from the grassy edge of the camp. Daisies. Tiny bluebells, buttercups, a few clovers, all gathered with slow hands and a quiet heart. She had picked them that afternoon during a short walk near the tree line, her boots brushing through the tall grass, her mind wandering through memories and dreams. The flowers had stood proudly among the weeds, small bursts of color in an otherwise dusty world. Now as she stepped back into the recovery tent, the scent of earth and grass followed her. Elsie waited inside with a row of empty glass bottles, lined up on a narrow wooden shelf. They were old medicine bottles mostly, cleaned, dried and repurposed for this gentle task. Some were green, some clear, one a soft shade of blue. Each one shimmered faintly in the late afternoon light. Without speaking, Margaret and Elsie began their quiet work. One by one they placed flowers into the bottles. A few stems here, a single blossom there. No bouquets, no grand arrangements, just enough to brighten a bedside, to remind someone of the world beyond the canvas walls. At the first bed, A sleeping soldier lay with his arm draped across his chest, the edge of a letter peeking from beneath his pillow. Margaret placed a bottle on the crate beside him, its single white daisy facing the light. She paused for a moment to watch how the sunlight caught the petals, how the green stem swirled inside the glass. "Beautiful," she whispered, mostly to herself. Elsie moved to the next bed and set a bottle with 3 bluebells beside another patient, this one gently snoring. She smiled softly. "They'll notice when they wake," and they would. Even in pain, even through fevered dreams, the presence of something soft and living had its own quiet language. Flowers didn't need to speak. Their beauty whispered. Further, down the row, Clara joined them with a few sprigs of lavender in her apron. "Found these by the well," she said gently. "Still sweet." Margaret took the lavender and placed it in a cobalt bottle beside a soldier who had barely stirred since yesterday. She didn't say anything, but she knew he would smell it when the breeze shifted, and maybe somewhere in his dreaming he would be reminded of his grandmother's garden or a summer picnic under the trees. The nurses moved gently through the tent, bottle by bottle, bed by bed. The colors grew. Small hints of yellow, violet, and green nestled among white sheets and soft pillows. The room, already full of stillness, now bloomed with something more. Hope. At one cot, a soldier sat awake, watching quietly as Margaret approached with a tiny bunch of clover and one soft pink bloom. "For me?" he asked, his voice barely above. A breath, she nodded. "For you." He smiled and reached out with trembling fingers to touch the petals. "Reminds me of our back field. Used to lie down in it and watch clouds with my brother." Margaret smiled. "Maybe you'll do that again, someday." He nodded, eyes still on the flower, as if it held a secret too lovely to speak aloud. The sun dipped lower, and the bottles caught the light like little lanterns. Some glowed amber, others turned silver. The flowers swayed slightly whenever a breeze moved through the tent, as if they too breathed. It wasn't much, not food, not medicine, but it was something. Something that reached past pain and brought beauty into the folds of suffering. One patient, eyes still closed, whispered as the bottle was set beside him, "Smells like home." Margaret's hands moved slowly. She didn't rush. Every bottle was placed with care, every stem adjusted until it stood just right. No one would see this work in any report. No doctor would write it down. But it mattered. Outside, the sky had begun to blush. Pinks and soft purples painted the clouds, and the air grew cooler. Birds sang a few final notes before quieting for the night. Inside the tent, the final flower was placed, a single buttercup beside a man who had not spoken in days. Margaret watched him for a moment, then tucked the bottle close to his hand where it might brush his fingers if he shifted in his sleep. And then the nurses stood together for a moment, looking down the rows. Where there had been only blankets and bandages, now there was color. Where there had been quiet breathing, now there was also the whisper of wild things, of grass and wind and growing petals. The tent had not changed, and yet it had. It had bloomed. Margaret held the empty basket in her hands and smiled softly. "We'll do it again in a few days," Elsie said. Margaret nodded. "Or sooner." The nurses stepped out into the cooling air, the last golden rays slipping across the path. Behind them, the soft flicker of flowers in bottles continued, like a gentle lullaby for the eyes. And in the hush of evening, the tent rested, beautiful in its stillness. Evening came slowly, as if the sky itself didn't want to disturb the calm below. The soft colors of dusk, pale pinks, quiet purples, and faded gold, settled gently over the field hospital. The wind, which had danced lightly all day, grew still. Inside the recovery tent, the light dimmed little by little, until the canvas walls no longer glowed with the sun, but sat in peaceful shadow. It was the hour when everything softened. Voices, movements, thoughts. Margaret stood near the entrance of the tent, holding a box of candles. Each one was short and simple, their wax sides slightly misshapen from the warmth of the day. She carried a small lantern in her other hand, the flame inside flickering gently. One by one, she walked the length of the tent, lighting a candle near each bed. Click. The sound of the match striking, the momentary scent of smoke, then the hush of flame catching on the wick. The first candle glowed beside a soldier sleeping deeply, his arms tucked around a rolled blanket. The light danced softly across his cheek, casting a warm curve over his features. Margaret moved on. Each bed received its own flame, not bright, not harsh, just enough to push back the darkness and give the room a kind of quiet life. The bottles, the flowers placed earlier, now shimmered in the candlelight, their petals gently catching the glow. Elsie followed behind, gently closing the tent flaps where the cool breeze tried to slip in. "It's getting chilly," she whispered. Margaret nodded, adjusting a blanket over a sleeping figure. Almost night. There was something sacred about this time. It was not just the end of a long day. It was a soft sigh, a letting go, a moment between effort and rest, between healing and dreaming. In the far corner, Clara lit the last candle on the supply table, next to a stack of linen cloths and a jar of lavender balm. She didn't speak. No one needed to. A few of the soldiers stirred, half awake, drawn by the flickering light. One turned slowly on his side and murmured, "Is it evening already?" Margaret smiled and knelt beside him. "It is. You've rested well." He nodded, then blinked at the candle's glow. "Looks like stars inside a tent." She looked up at the row of tiny flames, each one glowing, steady and small. "Yes," she said softly, "just like stars." She sat beside him for a moment. As he drifted back to sleep, the candle beside them flickered once, then settled again. Outside, the crickets began their soft chorus, rising and falling like breath. A lullaby from the grass, the sounds of war, of worry, of distance. They were far away now, as if held off by the thin walls of the tent and the warmth inside. Margaret moved once more, straightening the pillow of a young soldier who had been too tired to eat. She touched his forehead, not to check for fever, but simply to comfort. The candlelight fell across his blanket, making the white fabric glow like moonlight. She thought of home again, of her childhood bedroom with its single candle on the windowsill. Her mother would light it every night, even when they had oil lamps. "A small flame," she used to say, "keeps away big shadows." Margaret smiled at the memory. A breeze crept in again, stirring the canvas, and one of the candles shivered. Elsie quickly cupped her hand around it until it steadied. "It's like caring for little lives," she said softly. Margaret nodded. "Tiny guardians for the night." In the center of the tent, the room now glowed with a soft, even warmth. It wasn't bright, it wasn't meant to be. It was a resting light, a watching light. As they moved through the space, the nurses began to lower their voices even more, barely louder than the sound of slippers on the wood. Their movement slowed further. There was no schedule now, no pressure, only presence. Margaret returned to the front of the tent, where the matchbox and the candle tin lay on the table. She tucked them away and glanced around one last time. The faces of the soldiers, some pale, some flushed, some peaceful, some troubled, were all bathed in the same golden glow. The light smoothed their features, quieted their worry, softened their sleep. The flowers in their little bottles swayed slightly as the air shifted. The candle flames caught the petals in their flicker, and for a moment, the whole tent looked like a living dream, floating in quiet light. Margaret folded her hands in front of her and breathed in the calm. Elsie and Clara joined her near the entrance, each holding their aprons lightly, their faces tired but soft. "We should rest too," Clara whispered. Margaret nodded. "Just a little longer." They stood together, just inside the flap of the tent, watching the sleeping room lit by tiny flames. It was enough. In the gentle hush of candlelight, the day settled down, not with a sound, but with a feeling. A warm, steady hush. And as night embraced the camp, the tent stood glowing in the dark, like a lantern in the heart of the world. The first raindrops came quietly, so light, so soft, they sounded like a hush from the sky. Tap, tap, tap. The canvas roof of the medical tent caught each drop like a drumskin played with feathers. At first it was just a few taps, then the rhythm deepened, a soft pattering sound, steady and calm, spread gently across the tent. Margaret looked up as she tucked a blanket over one of the sleeping soldiers. She smiled. Rain. The scent arrived next, that clean, earthy smell that rises from the ground when the dry dust finally meets water. It drifted through the open flaps of the tent, mixing with the scent of candles, wildflowers, and warm linens. Elsie stepped inside with her hands cupped around a small lantern to keep the wind from dimming the flame. A few droplets clung to her sleeves. "It's raining," she whispered, setting the lantern down near the supply table. Margaret nodded. A soft one. The kind of rain that soothes instead of stirs. The kind that makes you want to wrap up. Lean back and listen. Around them, the soldiers slept or rested quietly. The warm candlelight still flickered softly beside each bed, now joined by the steady rhythm of rain above, like a lullaby from the sky itself. A breeze entered through a narrow gap, cool and damp. Margaret moved to close the flap, then turned and walked slowly down the row, checking each patient as she went. Some were asleep, others half awake, their eyes blinking lazily at the sound of rain. She stopped at one bed where a young soldier had kicked off his blanket in his sleep. She leaned down and gently tucked it back over him, smoothing it across his chest. His brow was damp with sweat, but his breathing was steady. She dipped a cloth in a warm bowl and patted his forehead. From the far side of the tent, Clara's voice rose in a whisper. She had taken a seat beside a bed and was speaking softly, not reading a letter, not giving instructions, just telling a story. "And the chickens kept escaping, so we named the smartest one General," she said with a chuckle under her breath. "He ruled the whole yard." The soldier beside her smiled faintly, eyes still closed, but clearly listening. Margaret paused, for a moment, then moved to a stool near another bed. She sat quietly, resting her hands in her lap. The candle beside her danced gently in the air, stirred by the rain. Elsie joined them too, pulling up a chair beside an older soldier who rarely spoke. She began a soft story of her own, about her father's old boat, about how it used to creak when they rowed out on the lake, and how she would lie on her back and watch the clouds float above. Each voice stayed low, almost like part of the rainfall itself. Their words weren't meant to excite or surprise, only to comfort, to fill the room with a quiet presence, the kind that eases worry and invites sleep. Outside, the rain picked up just a little more, brushing the tent in smooth, steady waves. Tap, tap, tip-tap, tip-tap. Inside, the room felt warmer than ever. The nurses wrapped patients in fresh blankets, tucking them under their arms, folding them around shoulders, like wrapping gifts in soft fabric. A few soldiers stirred and asked for water. Others mumbled dreams. One murmured the name of someone far away, then fell silent again. Margaret leaned toward one of the patients and spoke softly. "Would you like to hear something from home?" He nodded faintly, and she reached into her apron pocket, pulling out a small card, a recipe written in her mother's hand. She read it aloud as if it were a bedtime story. Apple pudding, 2 cups of flour, 1 spoon of cinnamon, 1 egg, beaten soft. The soldier's lips curved into a tiny smile. When she finished, he whispered, "That sounds like Sundays." Margaret nodded. "It does." The tent walls glistened in places where the canvas had soaked through slightly, but the water didn't leak. It just darkened the fabric and let the glow of candlelight shimmer through like golden lace. Each cot now looked like a little island, warm, dry, and quiet in a sea of gentle sound. Margaret stood again and moved slowly to the next patient. She checked the candle, adjusted the bottle of flowers, then smoothed the sheet with her palm. All was well. The sound of rain had become a part of everything now, in the way the nurses walked, in the way their words floated, in the soft breaths. Of the sleeping. Outside, puddles had begun to form, but inside it was warm and dry and safe. The rhythm of the day had folded into the rhythm of the night, and the rain, so steady, so soothing, continued to fall. The rain had eased into a steady rhythm outside, whispering over the tents like a lullaby from the sky. Inside the medical tent, the candlelight glowed softly, flickering against canvas walls. The soldiers were wrapped in their blankets, some deep in sleep, others resting with eyes half closed, lulled by the warmth and the quiet. Near the corner of the tent, away from the cots but still close enough to listen for any stirring, a small group of nurses sat together on low stools. In the center stood a short iron stove, its little fire gently glowing and warming the cool evening air. Margaret sat closest to the heat, her fingers wrapped around a ball of grey wool. Across her lap rested 2 knitting needles, their points clicking softly as she worked. Each movement was slow and careful, not rushed, not forced, just steady. Click, click, pull. She had knitted many socks since coming to the field hospital, pairs that had made their way into crates, then to soldiers headed to the front. Others she had given straight to the men resting nearby, when their feet were cold and the nights had turned sharp with frost. Tonight the knitting felt different, more peaceful. Maybe it was the rain, maybe it was the gentle firelight, maybe it was simply the feeling of having done a good day's work. Elsie sat beside her, unrolling a ball of deep brown yarn. "I'm on my second sock," she whispered with a quiet smile. "The first one's slightly crooked." Margaret chuckled softly. No soldier ever complained about crooked socks. Clara joined them a moment later, carrying a small tin of buttons and a thimble. "No knitting for me," she said as she settled down, "but I'll patch what I can." The 3 women sat close together, their shoulders nearly touching, their hands busy with simple things: yarn, needles, soft wool, smooth thread. The fire crackled gently in the stove, casting a warm orange light over their aprons and sleeves. Outside, the rain softened even more, becoming a background hum, like a baby's breath in sleep. Click, click, loop. The knitting needles moved like clock hands, slow and steady. With each row, the socks took shape. Not just fabric, but warmth. Not just stitches, but comfort. Margaret watched the wool gather beneath her hands, feeling it, stretch and curl and fold just right. Her grandmother had taught her how to knit on a rainy afternoon, much like this. She remembered her hands, wrinkled but sure, guiding her through the first clumsy loops. "Hold it gently," her grandmother had said. "Not too tight, not too loose, like holding someone's hand." Margaret smiled at the memory, and her fingers softened their grip just a little. In the nearby cots, a few soldiers stirred. One turned over, his blanket tucked tight beneath his chin. Another sighed and relaxed again, the candlelight glowing faintly beside him. The soft clinking of the knitting needles didn't disturb them. In fact, it seemed to soothe them, like the ticking of a clock in a quiet room. Elsie held up her sock in progress and examined it. "It's not very even." Margaret leaned over to look. "It's perfect," she said. "You can see the care in it." "Think he'll feel that?" "I think he already does." The fire popped once, then settled back into its gentle crackle. Clara threaded a needle and began to repair a worn sleeve. "These quiet jobs," she said softly, "they carry more weight than they look." Margaret nodded. "We stitch more than fabric." They worked for a long while, not speaking much. The room didn't need conversation, only the sound of quiet hands making something whole. At one point, a young soldier nearby opened his eyes and turned his head toward the group. "What are you making?" he asked, his voice barely above the sound of the rain. "Socks," Elsie replied with a smile. "For us?" Margaret nodded. "For you and for the others. To keep your feet warm when the world gets cold." The soldier smiled softly, then closed, his eyes again. "That's good," he murmured. "It's very good." The nurses kept knitting. The needles clicked like a gentle rhythm, not music, but something just as soft, a heartbeat of care, a breath of warmth. As the fire burned low and the rain thinned into mist, Margaret finished her sock and held it up. It was simple, thick, warm, the color of quiet stone. She folded it gently and placed it in a wooden basket beside her. Another, small gift, ready for tired feet. She looked around the tent once more. Most of the candles had burned down now, their light low and steady. The soldiers slept peacefully. The flowers in their little bottles swayed ever so slightly with the breeze. The air smelled of wool, warm metal, and rain-soaked earth. Margaret stretched her fingers and leaned back slightly, resting her eyes. This was a kind of healing too. Not the loud kind, not the dramatic kind, but the quiet, steady kind that came from hands doing good work, from warmth in cold spaces, from hearts thinking of others, a sock, a stitch, a breath. The tent glowed gently as night wrapped its arms around the camp, and the nurses kept knitting quietly, lovingly, until the basket was full. The rain had faded into a fine mist now, barely more than a whisper outside the tent. Inside, the warmth of the little stove lingered, casting a soft orange glow that reached into every quiet corner. Most of the soldiers had drifted into deep sleep, the flickering candlelight still dancing gently beside their beds. The nurses moved softly, finishing the last of their evening tasks. Pillows were adjusted, the floor swept quietly, and woolen socks folded neatly in a basket near the fire. It was the kind of peace that settled after a long day, not just quiet but comforting. Then came a familiar smell, buttery and warm. Margaret looked up from her stool and saw Clara entering the tent, holding a cloth-covered basket in her arms and a proud little smile on her face. "I raided the kitchen," Clara whispered, her eyes twinkling. Still warm, Margaret and Elsie perked up like children hearing the promise of a story. Clara pulled back the cloth, revealing a bundle of fresh biscuits, their golden tops slightly cracked, steam still rising from their centers. The scent drifted through the tent, wrapping around the nurses like a hug. "They're plain, I'm afraid," Clara added, "but soft, and they came out of the oven, not a tin." Elsie clapped her hands softly. "They smell like kindness." Margaret stood and fetched the tea kettle from the warming plate near the stove. It was still half full. As she poured the tea into tin cups, she glanced at the sleeping patients. Most were sound asleep, undisturbed by the quiet joy unfolding in the far corner of the tent. The nurses gathered around a small wooden crate they used as a table. They sat on overturned baskets and low stools, their hands wrapped around warm cups and soft biscuits. The first bite was blissful, warm, tender, just slightly crumbly. Elsie closed her eyes with the first taste. "Oh, that's perfect," she whispered. "Too much salt," Clara mumbled, chewing thoughtfully. "Not at all," Margaret said. "It tastes like it was made with care." They laughed, softly, gently, so as not to wake anyone. It was the kind of laughter that didn't need volume, it only needed company. Elsie took a small sip of her tea and leaned back slightly. "I don't remember the last time we had a treat like this," Clara smiled. "That's why I stole them, figured we needed one." They laughed again, not loud but low and warm, like laughter meant only for that small circle. Like a story, told under blankets. The rain, now only a soft drizzle, tapped gently against the canvas. The fire crackled in the stove, and a breeze rustled the leaves just beyond the tent. The world was quiet, but the little circle of nurses felt full. Margaret broke her biscuit in half and offered it to Elsie. "This half's got the edge, the crispy part," Elsie smiled. "You really do like me." Clara pretended to look offended. "I saved the batch. Shouldn't I get the crispy part?" "Too late," Margaret said, and they all laughed again, shoulders shaking slightly, eyes glimmering in the candlelight. Outside, a distant owl called into the night. Inside, the biscuits disappeared slowly, one by one. No one hurried. The warmth was not just in the tea and the fire. It was in the sharing, in the togetherness. They talked quietly while they ate. Not about the war, not about tomorrow, just little things, about Clara's garden back home and how she missed her cat, about a story Elsie remembered from school, about how Margaret once tried to bake and forgot the flour entirely. "I made something closer to soup," she whispered, and they all bent over in soft, silent laughter again. It was laughter that didn't need to be big to feel big. It filled the tent, but not with noise, with love. When the biscuits were gone, they sat still for a moment longer, holding their empty cups, their hands wrapped around the fading warmth. None of them wanted to move yet. Margaret looked toward the rows of cots. The soldiers still rested peacefully, some murmuring in dreams, others curled gently beneath their blankets. The room felt like a lullaby, one sung by firelight, tea, and the scent of warm biscuits. She leaned back and whispered, "Do you ever feel like we're floating?" Elsie tilted her head. "Floating?" Margaret nodded. "Like we're in a bubble of quiet, just for a little while, Outside, everything is hard and loud, but in here, Clara said, finishing her thought, it's like the world pauses. They all sat still for a moment longer, listening to the soft tick of rain, the sleepy rustle of blankets, and the crackling stove. Then, slowly, they began to clean up. Cups stacked, crumbs brushed into a cloth. The empty biscuit basket folded closed again. Margaret poured the last of the tea into the fire, where it hissed quietly and sent up a puff of steam. The glow of the candles had dimmed, and the fire was nearly down to embers, but the peace remained. The laughter, though faded, still lingered in the air, like a perfume or a remembered song. And the nurses moved softly back to their places, warmed not just by biscuits and tea, but by each other. Rain had passed sometime in the early morning hours, leaving behind the soft scent of wet earth and leaves. The world outside the hospital tents glistened with dew, and the air was cool and fresh, the kind that made you want to breathe a little deeper and move a little slower. Margaret walked quietly through the narrow path between the canvas walls, carrying a folded apron filled with fresh cloths. She was headed toward the supply tent, where the linen was kept, stacked neatly in wooden crates and bundled with twine. The sun had just begun to rise, turning the edges of the clouds into golden, as her boots made almost no sound on the damp ground. As she neared the supply tent, something caught her eye. A small flutter low to the ground near the back corner of the tent wall. She paused. Tucked beneath a tangle of brush and wild grass, half hidden in the shadows, was a tiny bird nest. She stepped closer, careful not to make a sound. The nest was woven tightly with twigs, bits of dry straw, and a few strands of what looked like thread or cloth, perhaps taken from an old bandage left near the tent. Inside were 3 tiny chicks, their heads barely visible, soft fuzz covering their pink skin. As she stood watching, one of the chicks stretched its neck upward, its beak opening wide in a silent cry, expecting food. Another stirred gently, nudging its sibling, while the third remained still, breathing softly. Margaret smiled and crouched down beside the nest, keeping her distance so as not to frighten them. She could hear the soft rustle of wings nearby, the mother bird no doubt watching. From a branch overhead, Margaret looked up and spotted her, perched quietly on the edge of a low branch, her feathers still damp from the rain. The bird didn't flee, didn't cry out. She simply watched. It was a moment, small, delicate, and perfect. Margaret stayed. There, crouched beside the nest, her hands resting on her knees, the folded apron forgotten in her lap. The noise of the camp, the soft clatter of a kettle, the distant call of a medic, even the low murmur of voices, faded away. All she heard was the quiet, the tiny breath of life in that nest, the soft flap of the bird's wings, the wind rustling the grass. She could have missed it. Anyone else might have walked past without seeing, but she had paused, and now she was here, witness to something fragile and beautiful. A few moments later, Elsie appeared around the corner, carrying a bundle of dried herbs for the wash basin. She slowed when she saw Margaret kneeling by the brush. "What is it?" she whispered, stepping softly. Margaret smiled and pointed gently. Elsie came closer and knelt beside her. Her eyes widened when she saw the nest. "Oh," she breathed. "Look at them." The 2 nurses sat in silence for a while, just watching the tiny creatures. One of the chicks opened its beak again, then settled back down into the soft lining of the nest. Its siblings leaned against it, as if cuddling in their sleep. "They're so small," Elsie whispered. Margaret nodded. "And still here, in all of this." A long silence followed, the kind that didn't feel empty but full of quiet awe, full of something gentle and ancient. After a while, the mother bird fluttered down to the edge of the nest, tilting her head at the 2 humans. Then she leaned into the twigs and offered a tiny worm to the open beak of one chick. Margaret and Elsie watched, not daring to move. It was a quiet act of care, one small life feeding another, keeping the world going, one breath at a time. When the feeding was done, the mother bird hopped up to the edge of the nest and flew off again, disappearing into the trees. Margaret finally stood, brushing her hands gently on her apron. "We should mark the spot," she said. "So no one steps too close." Elsie nodded. She found 2 small stones nearby and placed them on either side of the nest, far enough not to disturb it, but close enough to catch the eye. As they turned to leave, Margaret glanced back one last time. The nest sat perfectly still, nestled in, the shadows hidden from harm, a reminder that life, even in the midst of wounds and war, still found a way to be soft. Back inside the tent, the nurses resumed their morning routines. Bowls were filled with warm water, tea was poured, and blankets were adjusted with practiced hands, but all the while the memory of the nest stayed with them. Later that day, when Clara asked why Margaret seemed so quiet, she simply said, "I saw something small, something hopeful." Clara didn't ask more. She only smiled and poured a cup of tea. And outside, beneath the edge of the supply tent, the nest remained, hidden in the grass, safe in the hush, holding the smallest kind of hope the world could offer. Evening had returned, folding its quiet arms around the camp once more. The last rays of sunlight slipped behind the trees, leaving a dusky blue sky and a hush in the air. A cool breeze wandered through the hospital grounds, soft and clean after the rain, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and blooming grass. Inside, the recovery tent, the lamps had been lit. Not bright ones, just a few gentle flames, enough to cast a soft golden glow across the canvas walls. The shadows were long but kind, stretching slowly across the wooden floorboards as if they too were preparing to rest. It was time. The nurses moved quietly, almost like shadows themselves. They didn't need to be told what to do. This hour had become a ritual, not written in any book but deeply understood, tucking everyone in. Margaret started at the far end of the tent, a folded blanket draped over her arm and a soft cloth tucked into her apron. She walked slowly between the rows of cots, pausing at each one, her footsteps nearly silent on the floor. At the first bed, a young soldier lay already asleep, his arm curled gently beneath his head. Margaret leaned down and gently pulled the blanket higher over his shoulder, tucking it in with slow, careful hands. She smoothed the edge near his chest, then reached for his pillow and gave it the softest fluff. He didn't stir, but his breathing deepened, as though his body had felt the kindness. Across the tent, Elsie worked in quiet rhythm as well. She hummed very softly. Not a song really, just a little tune without words, a melody that floated through the air like a warm breeze. She adjusted a blanket here, tucked a foot back in there. She paused at one cot to stroke the hair of a sleeping man whose brow still creased even in dreams. She whispered, "Shh, you're safe now," and smoothed the sheet until the wrinkles disappeared. Clara moved more slowly, her steps a little heavier, but her hands no less gentle. She took special care with the soldiers who were still half awake, offering them warm water in tin cups and helping them shift into more comfortable positions before laying the blankets back over them. Margaret came to a patient who had been restless earlier in the day. His eyes were closed now, but his arms were uncovered, one hand twitching faintly. She gently lifted the wool blanket and laid it over him, smoothing it from chest to toes, then tucked the corners in tightly, not too tight, just enough to feel held. She crouched beside his cot for a moment, watching the candlelight flicker across his face. His jaw softened, his fingers relaxed. She gave a small smile and rose. All around the tent, this soft work continued. There were no announcements, no need for words, only the rhythm of care, as slow and sure as a lullaby. At one bed, a soldier was already awake, blinking sleepily at the ceiling. "Almost bedtime," he murmured. Margaret nodded. "Just about. Need anything?" He shook his head. "Just the usual." She smiled and pulled his blanket up, tucking it neatly beneath his arms, folding it softly around his sides like wrapping a child in warmth. Then she reached under his pillow and adjusted it gently, giving it a little fluff. "Better?" He sighed and nodded. "Much." The tent felt different. During this hour, it was no longer a space for treatment, for bandages or medicine. It had become something quieter, something tender, a place of rest. The flower bottles still sat by each bedside, their petals now slightly drooped from the day but still colorful, The candles flickered beside them, casting light across the glass and making the petals glow faintly. Margaret paused at her next bed. An older man, his face weathered but calm. He had lost his left arm weeks ago, and some nights he still wept in his sleep. But not tonight. Tonight his eyes were closed, his breathing deep and even. She didn't wake him. She simply pulled the blanket a little higher and touched his shoulder, once gently. Behind her, Elsie adjusted one last cot and stood still for a moment. "All tucked in," she whispered mostly to herself. Margaret looked down the length of the tent. Every bed had been seen, every soldier covered, every pillow fluffed, every corner tucked. The room glowed like a safe lantern in the dark. Clara returned from the other end with a slow smile. "They're settled." The nurses stood together for a moment, listening to the breathing. Steady, soft, safe. A quiet chorus of sleep. Outside, the breeze picked up again, rustling the trees just beyond the tent. A few stars began to blink into the sky, and the moon's light stretched faintly across the field. Margaret folded the last blanket and placed it on a nearby chair, just in case someone needed it later. Then she walked to the front of the tent, blew gently on a candle, and watched the flame fade into a curl of smoke. The hush of night settled deeper, and the men, soldiers, sons, dreamers, friends, lay wrapped in warmth, in silence, in care. Every one of them tucked in, as gently as a mother would. Night had fully settled over the camp. The sky above was a quiet sea of stars, the moon soft and watchful. Inside the recovery tent, everything was wrapped in stillness. The candles near each bed had burned low, their flames now small and steady. Shadows stretched along the canvas. Walls, but they did not feel cold or empty, only calm. In the far corner of the tent, a small lantern hung from a wooden hook. Its light was warm and golden, flickering gently like a heartbeat. Below it sat Clara, a thick book resting on her lap, its worn spine showing the love of many hands. A few of the resting soldiers were still awake, not in pain, not fully restless, but lingering somewhere between wakefulness and sleep. Their eyes half open, their hands resting gently on their blankets. Clara opened the book with slow fingers. She didn't announce anything. She simply began to read. Her voice was soft, low, and smooth, like the sound of rain on a rooftop, or wind-rustling leaves in a quiet forest. Once, in a land where the sun never rose too high and the sea sang to the shore, there lived a boy who spoke the language of birds. The soldiers didn't move, but a shift passed through the room. A long breath, a stretch of still fingers, very slight turn of a head. Margaret, folding a towel nearby, paused and smiled. She had heard this story before, an old myth passed down through generations, one of those tales that lingered in the bones long after it had been told. Clara continued. Was not a prince nor a warrior. He had no sword, no crown, but he carried with him something far stronger, the kindness of listening. Margaret quietly crossed the tent and took a seat near the lantern, not too close, but within the circle of light. Elsie soon joined her, a ball of half-knitted yarn in her lap. Neither said a word. They simply listened. And in the darkest part of the forest where no one dared to go, he found a nest of nightingales and sat with them until they sang again. Clara's voice flowed like water in a slow stream, each word landing gently on the ears of those who heard. The patients who were still awake relaxed further into their pillows. One of them, an older man, let out a breath that almost sounded like a sigh of peace. The stories weren't just entertainment here, they were medicine too, not for the body but for the heart. They soothed places that couldn't be bandaged. They traveled far beyond the tent walls, carrying listeners to places where no war had ever touched. He listened to the wind, to the trees, to the river that forgot how to flow. And when he spoke with such softness that even the stones remembered how to sing. The flicker of the lantern caught the edge of the book's pages, making them glow faintly, like old parchment in a dream. Clara turned each one slowly, her voice never rushing, never rising. It had no need to. Margaret closed her eyes, letting the words paint pictures in her mind. She imagined the boy from the story, sitting by the riverbank, surrounded by birds and blooming things. She imagined peace, not just the quiet in the tent, but a world where silence meant safety, not fear. One soldier shifted and opened his eyes just for a moment. He turned his head slightly toward Clara, then closed his eyes again, his breathing slow and steady. Elsie began knitting again, her needles barely making a sound. The rhythm of her stitches matched the rhythm of the story. Outside, a breeze moved gently through the trees. The tent canvas fluttered softly, as if even the night was leaning in to listen. And when the stars heard the boy's voice, they shimmered brighter, not because he asked them to, but because they felt seen. No one spoke. No one stirred. The air in the tent felt thick with comfort, the kind that only comes when words and warmth fill every shadow. When Clara reached the end of the chapter, she didn't close the book right away. She simply held the page open and looked out across the room. Most of the soldiers were asleep now, their faces calm, their limbs relaxed beneath soft blankets. The flickering candlelight traced their features like a gentle artist's hand. Clara turned another page. The boy never sought reward. He didn't want gold or glory, only quiet, only peace. And wherever he went, the world grew softer behind him. Margaret opened her eyes again. She knew it was time to end soon. But there was something in the air, something that made it hard to leave the moment. Clara gently closed the book, pressing her hand to the cover. Then she looked around, her voice now even softer. "Tomorrow I'll read about the girl who followed the moon." Elsie smiled. "I'd like that." They stood slowly, collecting the extra blankets, folding the spare shawl left near the chair. The lantern flickered once, then settled again, casting one last soft light across the tent before being turned low. The patients slept soundly, their dreams now filled with birds, rivers, forests, and starlight. And the tent, no longer just. The hospital had felt like a story itself, a safe chapter, gently written by warm voices, steady hands, and the hush of a night that knew how to hold people softly. The lantern had been dimmed, the stories had ended, and the tent had fallen into a deep, peaceful hush. The only sounds were the soft breaths of sleeping soldiers and the faint rustle of canvas walls in the cool night breeze. Margaret sat alone now, on a small wooden stool just outside the tent. The air was cool, the ground still damp from the earlier rain. Overhead the stars shimmered, quiet companions in the sky, distant but steady. She wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders and looked up toward the moon, which hovered low and golden on the horizon. The night was deep, but not heavy. It felt open, soft, a time for remembering. Her thoughts drifted, slowly, gently, back to the place she had come from. A little village, far from the noise of war. Far from tents and bandages and whispered worries in the dark. She could see it clearly in her mind. The narrow lane that led from the church to the bakery, the cobbled path where children played with hoops and marbles, the wide stretch of golden. Fields that swayed like an ocean whenever the wind moved through them. Those fields, they were her favorite. She remembered running through them barefoot as a girl, her apron flapping, arms outstretched like wings. The wheat would reach her waist, sometimes higher, brushing against her hands as she ran. It smelled of sun and dust and life. In spring, the fields turned green first, fresh, glowing green that shimmered in the morning light. Then, slowly, they ripened into gold, glowing under the sky, stretching as far as the eye could see. And at sunset, when the light struck just right, it was like standing in a world made of fire and honey. Her father had worked in those fields, day after day, year after year. She remembered the sound of his boots in the early morning, the creak of the gate, the smell of soil on his hands when he returned. He didn't speak much, but he always smiled when she brought him water in the midday sun. Her mother's hands too had the smell of earth, not from the fields but from the garden beside the house, a small patch of tomatoes, onions and mint. She could see her mother now, kneeling in the dirt, brushing her hands against her apron, standing with a satisfied sigh. Margaret closed her eyes and breathed in the memory. She remembered the sound of the dinner bell, the call of the cows from the hill, the way the sunset hit the roof of their little cottage and made it look like it was glowing. She remembered laughter, not loud, but constant, woven into the daily rhythm like thread through fabric. It had been such a simple place, And in this moment, in the stillness of a hospital camp far from home, it felt like another world entirely. She hadn't seen those fields in over a year, hadn't walked down that lane, hadn't felt the soil beneath her feet or seen the way the clouds rolled over the hills. But tonight, with nothing but stars above her and a shawl around her shoulders, it felt close, as if she could turn her head and see the wheat swaying again, as if her mother might step out from the garden and call her name. Margaret opened her eyes and looked toward the horizon. The darkness didn't frighten her. It felt gentle, accepting. She knew why she had come here, to this place, to this field hospital, to these men who needed care. She had wanted to help, to do something kind in a world that had gone hard, but sometimes, just sometimes, she missed being a daughter, a sister, a girl who could lose herself in fields of gold. A single tear slipped down her cheek, though she didn't feel sad. It wasn't sorrow. It was softness, a kind of quiet ache that came with remembering love. Behind her, the tent glowed faintly. The soldiers slept on. The nurses, too, had settled. Everything was safe still at rest, and she sat in the hush of it all, wrapped in memory. From the edge of the path, a small breeze lifted, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and wild mint, just like the garden back home. She closed her eyes again and let it pass through her, as if her village had reached across miles to remind her she wasn't forgotten. "I'll come back," she whispered into the night. "When it's all done, when it's quiet again." The stars didn't answer, but they twinkled a little brighter as if they'd heard. She stayed there for a little while longer, thinking of home, of golden fields, of soft footsteps on the path, until her heart felt full again. Then she stood, brushed off her skirt, and walked slowly back toward the tent. The night held her gently like an old friend, and behind her eyes, the fields swayed on, golden, endless, and waiting. The morning light was slow to arrive, filtered through a pale sky and streaks of drifting clouds. A light mist clung to the earth, wrapping the camp in a soft grey shawl. Everything looked quieter somehow, as if the world was speaking in whispers. Autumn had come. It hadn't announced itself loudly. There was no sudden change, no sharp wind or biting cold, just small, gentle signs, the crispness in the air, the golden edges on the leaves, the deeper hush in the trees. Margaret stepped outside the tent just after breakfast had been served. The air greeted her with coolness on her cheeks and the faint scent of dry grass and wood smoke. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and began her walk toward the edge of the camp, not for any task, just for a moment alone. As she neared the outer fence, the landscape began to shift. Fewer tents, more trees. The loudest sounds were her own footsteps and the occasional sigh of wind through the branches. And then she saw them, the leaves. They were falling, one by one, two by two, from every direction, drifting from tall, slender trees with branches that curved like arms. Each leaf floated down gently, as if reluctant to touch the earth. Some twisted, others glided. None were in a hurry. Margaret stopped walking and just stood there, watching. The leaves were in every color of autumn: golden yellow, burnt orange, deep red, soft brown. They swirled through the air like dancers, turning and tipping in silence. They collected on the grass in soft piles, like the camp was being tucked in for winter. She breathed in deeply. There was something about this moment, something unspoken. The kind of stillness that went beyond silence. A stillness that reached into the chest and made the heart slow down. Even time seemed to pause, as if it too wanted to watch the leaves fall. She walked closer to one of the trees, letting her fingers brush the bark as she passed. It was rough but warm from the early sun. Beneath her boots, the ground crunched lightly, a layer of fresh fallen leaves, not yet soaked by rain or buried in mud. A leaf drifted down and landed in her open palm. She looked at it closely. A deep orange maple leaf, perfect in shape, with tiny dark veins running across its surface like a quiet map. She turned it over in her fingers and smiled. It was small and light, but it carried the weight of the season. Autumn had always been her favorite time of year. Back home, the fields would turn the color of fire, and the air would smell like cider and baked bread. Her mother would pull out the heavier quilts, and her father would stack firewood by the door. The world would slow down, not in sadness, but in readiness, as if preparing for a long, peaceful rest. Margaret closed her eyes and listened. The wind moved through the branches, brushing the trees like fingertips across a piano. The leaves answered with soft rustling, a quiet music that seemed written just for this morning. There were no carriages, no guns, no voices, just air and light and falling things. She walked a little farther, away from the path, until the tents were no longer visible. Here she was surrounded by color. The trees formed a small grove, their trunks spaced just far enough apart to let the sunlight dance between them. She sat on a low stone, smoothed by time and weather, and looked up. Leaves floated down all around her. Some caught in her hair. One landed on her lap. Another brushed her cheek on its way past. She didn't move. She didn't speak. She just let herself be. In this small pocket of the world, war did not exist. There were no wounded, no whispered goodbyes. Only trees letting go of their leaves. Only a nurse sitting among them, feeling something she hadn't felt in a long time. Stillness. Real, full stillness. Not the kind that comes when work is finished or sleep arrives, but the kind that fills the soul. The kind that says, you are part of something quiet and beautiful, and it needs nothing from you but your presence. She sat for what might have been 10 minutes or an hour. Time had folded itself into the falling leaves. Then she rose, slowly brushing off her skirt, and looked around one last time. The grove would stay here. The trees would keep letting go, and the leaves would keep falling just as they had for centuries. She picked up one leaf and tucked it into her apron pocket, a little piece of stillness to carry back with her. As she made her way back to the tent, the wind picked up slightly, lifting more leaves into the air. They swirled around her like blessings, like gentle hands waving her home. Back inside the recovery tent, the work would go on. Warm cloths, quiet voices, steady hands. But Margaret would carry this moment with her, a place where the world had paused, where the leaves had fallen, and time, for just a little while, had stood still. The tent was quiet now, wrapped in the hush of night. Inside, the candles had burned low, and the soft breaths of sleeping soldiers rose and fell in steady rhythm. The nurses had completed their rounds, folded the last of the blankets and whispered their final good nights. But Margaret couldn't sleep just yet. There was something about the night, something gentle and calling, that tugged at her heart. So she rose quietly from her cot, slipped on her shawl and stepped outside. The air was cool, crisp and clean. The kind of air that feels brand new, as if the sky had pressed reset on the day. She walked slowly, her boots brushing softly, over the dirt path. The lights of the camp were dim now, only a few flickering lanterns guiding the edges of the tents. Beyond them stretched open fields and tall trees, and above it all were the stars. They filled the sky, thousands of them, scattered like sugar over velvet. Some shimmered faintly, others blinked boldly. The longer she stared, the more she saw. Clusters, ribbons, stories written in light. She let out a soft breath. There was something about walking under stars that made her feel both small and safe. Like she was part of something enormous, but still seen, still held. The moon was high and round, casting silver light across the quiet land. It touched the tops of the tents, the edges of the trees, and the tips of the wild grasses that waved gently in the breeze. Everything glowed just a little. Margaret left the camp path and wandered toward the open field nearby, the one where the grass grew tall and wildflowers had bloomed in summer. Now in autumn it had faded into soft gold and brown, but it still swayed with the same gentle music. Her steps were slow. There was no rush, she had no destination. This was a walk for the soul, not for distance. Above her the stars twinkled without sound. She tilted her head back and imagined her village beneath this same sky. Her mother, maybe sitting by the window. Her father out back, tending the firewood. Were they looking up too? Were they thinking of her? She closed her eyes and stood still, for a moment, listening to the silence, but it wasn't empty. The night was full of breath, full of wind, full of light, so soft it couldn't be felt on the skin, but it reached the heart. She took another few steps and found herself at the edge of the tall grass. The breeze lifted her hair gently, and she wrapped her shawl a little tighter around her shoulders. In the distance, an owl called once. Then again, a little farther away, it felt like the world was speaking in a language only the stars understood. She lowered herself onto a smooth stone beneath an old tree, one she had passed a dozen times during the day, but had never noticed quite like this. By moonlight, the bark looked silver. The branches above formed a delicate frame for the sky. Margaret sat there quietly, not thinking, not planning, just being. She traced the patterns of stars with her eyes, remembering stories her grandmother used to tell. "That one's the hunter," she would say, pointing. "And that little cluster, that's the sheep he watches over. They stay close to him even in the sky." Margaret smiled softly at the memory. She could almost hear her grandmother's voice in the breeze, full of warmth and old wisdom. Time passed. The stars turned ever so slightly. Somewhere nearby, a leaf fell from a tree and landed on the ground with a sound so faint it was almost imagined. She felt the bigness of the world all around her, the kind that doesn't frighten but comforts, the kind that says, "Everything is moving, yes, but gently, and you are part of it quietly too." After a while she stood again and brushed the grass from her skirt. Her legs had grown a little stiff, but her heart felt softer somehow, lighter. She looked back at the tents in the distance. They glowed like small lanterns in the dark, safe and still. The soldiers would be sleeping peacefully now. The nurses too. She began to walk back slowly, her steps making only the lightest sounds against the ground. The stars stayed with her, above, beside, within. She could feel them now, not just as lights, but as company. When she reached the tent, she paused before going inside. She looked up one more time and whispered softly into the night, "Thank you." Then she stepped inside and let the canvas close behind her. The air inside was warm, the candlelight low, the breathing even. She slipped quietly into her cot, pulled the blanket over her shoulders, and let her eyes close. Outside, the stars continued their watch, and the world turned, slowly, silently, holding everything in a quiet, steady embrace. The sky was just beginning to blush with the first light of morning. Soft blue brushed gently against the fading stars, and the last of the night's hush still lingered like a whisper in the air. From somewhere in the trees beyond the camp, a bird sang, then another. A few short chirps, a lilting trill, a gentle call answered by another far off. The dawn chorus had begun, not loud or sudden, but with the slow unfolding of nature's quiet music. Inside the recovery tent, all was still. The air was cool and smelled faintly of canvas, candle wax, and the flowers placed near each bed. The lanterns had long gone out, and the warm coals in the stove had faded into a soft orange glow. Margaret stirred in her cot, blinking slowly at the canvas ceiling above. She lay still for a few moments, listening to the birds. Their song was so familiar now, like a friend's voice greeting her each morning. She sat up slowly, wrapped her shawl around her shoulders, and stood with a soft stretch. The world moved gently at this hour. Even her breath felt slower, sir. She stepped outside. The cool air met her skin, waking her fully. The grass was damp beneath her boots, and a soft mist hung low across the camp. The trees nearby were painted in pale light, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. She walked toward the small kitchen tent, where a kettle was already on the fire. Steam curled up into the sky, and the scent of tea leaves drifted in the air. Clara was already there, crouched near the fire with a blanket around her shoulders. "Morning," Clara whispered, handing Margaret a tin cup. Margaret smiled and took it. "Morning." They sat on two overturned crates, sipping their tea, in silence. Around them the camp began to stir, not quickly, not noisily. Just the slow signs of waking. A door flap rustled. Footsteps padded across the damp ground. Somewhere water splashed into a bowl. It was the rhythm of the place, slow, caring, repeated each morning like the soft verse of a poem. Elsie appeared next, rubbing her eyes and stifling a yawn. Is it cinnamon today?" Margaret nodded. "Just a pinch. They shared the tea in soft sips, warming their hands on the cups. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. Their minds were waking slowly, their hearts easing into the day like sunlight warming the ground. Soon it was time to begin. Margaret returned to the recovery tent, where the candlelight was gently relit, and the bowls for morning washing were set out. Warm water was fetched, soft cloths unfolded, clean bandages prepared. One by one, the patients began to stir. A soldier blinked open his eyes and stretched carefully beneath his blanket. Another turned on his side, smiling faintly as the bird song reached his ears. Margaret moved quietly between the beds, checking each one with a gentle glance, a warm hand on a shoulder, or a soft greeting. "Good morning, Tom. Slept well?" A slow nod. "Time for tea in a moment," she whispered. The patients trusted this hour, this soft beginning. They knew they would not be rushed or startled, just gently lifted into wakefulness, surrounded by care. Elsie arrived next, carrying fresh cloths. She began with the first cot, dipping a warm cloth in the bowl and wiping a sleeping man's forehead. He sighed contentedly but didn't wake. That was all right, there was time. By the third bed, Margaret was helping a soldier sit up. "Feeling steady?" she asked, tucking a pillow behind his back. He nodded. "Bit better," she smiled. "You look it." She placed a small flower bottle beside his bed, one with a new sprig of lavender. The purple bloom leaned toward the sunlight as it peeked through the edge of the tent flap. At another bed, Clara read quietly from a folded letter. The patient smiled and closed his eyes, letting the words carry him home for a few moments. Back near the stove, the tea was ready. Margaret poured it into tin mugs and delivered them one by one, her hands steady, her steps slow. She paused often, to adjust a blanket, to listen to a few sleepy words, to offer a nod or a smile. The morning light grew stronger now, brushing the canvas walls in warm gold. The leaves outside sparkled with dew, and the birds still sang, though softer now, as if their work was done. The tent glowed, not with fire, not with sound, but with presence, with kindness, with the quiet joy of beginning again. Margaret stood for a moment near the center of the tent, her cup in hand, watching her fellow nurses move gently between the beds. They didn't speak much. Their bodies knew what to do. The rhythm of care had become part of them. Fold, tuck, pour, smile. This was what healing looked like. Not just medicine and bandages, but mornings like this, simple, soft, full of warmth. A soldier nearby looked up at her and said quietly, "It's a good morning." She nodded. "Yes, it really is." And the day continued, not rushed, not loud, just another quiet step forward, in the slow, steady rhythm of love. The morning was moving gently along. Tea had been poured, warm cloths had soothed tired faces, and soft voices had passed through the tent like early sunlight, steady and calm. Margaret was folding a fresh set of towels when she heard footsteps approaching the tent. They were light and careful, not hurried like a courier's nor firm like a medic's. Just soft, unsure steps. She turned toward the entrance just as the canvas flap lifted. A young woman stood there, her uniform crisp, her shoes freshly brushed, and her eyes wide with both nervousness and wonder. A small satchel hung over her shoulder, and her fingers gripped the strap as though she wasn't quite sure what to do with her hands. Margaret offered a kind smile. "You must be the new nurse." The young woman nodded. "Yes, I'm Anna." "Welcome, Anna," Margaret said, motioning her in. "Come in slowly. This tent likes peace." Anna stepped forward carefully, letting the flap fall behind her. She took a moment to look around, at the rows of cots, the flower bottles on the small tables, the gentle flicker of candles, and the soft sound of someone humming from the far end. "It's quieter than I expected," she whispered. Margaret nodded. "Everything here is slower. That's how healing happens." Elsie appeared from behind a cot, carrying a bowl of clean water. "You're just in time for the second round of morning washes," she said with a smile. "And for your first cup of cinnamon tea." Anna's shoulders relaxed just slightly. "I'd love some." They led her to a wooden stool near the washstand. Margaret handed her a cup and sat beside her. You'll find we don't do things fast here, she said gently. Everything has its own rhythm. You'll learn it. Anna nodded, sipping the tea slowly. I'm used to busy awards. Everything there moves so fast, I barely remembered faces. Margaret looked around the tent at the sleeping men, the slowly swaying curtains, the folded linens. Here, she said, you'll remember every face. After tea, they walked the tent together. Margaret showed Anna how to fold a blanket. Just so, not tight, but enough to make someone feel held. She explained how the candles were placed in the same order each evening, how the flower bottles were changed every few days, always with something fresh, how even the tea was served. With the same motion, 2 hands, 1 pause and a quiet smile. These little things, Margaret said, they aren't small. They're the whole thing. Anna watched closely. She didn't speak much, but her eyes followed every movement. Margaret let her help with the 3rd bed, a soldier named Samuel, who had a bandaged leg and often hummed in his sleep. Gently. Now, Margaret whispered, as Anna tucked the edge of his blanket. Fold once, then lift the pillow just a touch, like smoothing sleep itself. Anna nodded, her hands moving slowly. Like this? Just like that. Samuel stirred, opened his eyes for a moment, saw the 2 nurses, and closed them again with a peaceful sigh. Later, Anna helped Elsie with the linen shelf, arranging the clean towels in neat rows. Each fold faced the same way. Each stack was placed with a small space between them, just enough for breathing room. I didn't think towels needed so much care, Anna said softly. Elsie smiled. They're not just towels, they're warmth, their softness on someone's skin after weeks of fear. Anna looked at the folded stack again, and this time she understood. They spent the rest of the morning moving slowly between tasks. Anna carried the flower basket, placing a new daisy near a soldier's bed. Margaret showed her how to dab lavender oil into a bowl of water to help with sleep. Clara handed her a folded letter to read aloud to a patient whose eyes still hadn't fully healed. Anna's voice trembled a little at first, but soon it softened. By the time she finished, the soldier had fallen asleep. You did well, Clara said with a nod. Gentle words are just as strong as medicine. By midday, the sun filtered through the canvas roof like warm butter, and the whole tent seemed to glow. Anna stood by the tent's open flap, looking out across the field, the trees, the low stone path, the birds fluttering through the tall grass. It's so peaceful here, she whispered. Margaret joined her. Yes, it's not a place of noise, but of presence. Here, even silence holds hands. Anna looked back into the tent. The other nurses moved in slow rhythm. The soldiers breathed quietly in their cots. The soft hum of healing continued. She took a deep breath, and for the first time all morning, her shoulders fully relaxed. I think, she said, I can learn this rhythm. Margaret nodded, placing a gentle hand on her arm. You all ready? Sa femme, it was a quiet afternoon, the kind where the sunlight settled softly on everything. Not too bright, not too warm, just a calm golden glow that drifted through the canvas tent and stretched gently across the wooden floor. Margaret was sorting folded cloths near the washstand when she heard her name called from the entrance. Mail's come, Elsie said. Stepping inside with a small bundle in her arms, Margaret smiled. Anything for us? Elsie nodded, holding out a single envelope. This one's addressed to all of us, the nurses in the recovery tent. Margaret took the letter carefully. The paper was creased at the corners but neat. The handwriting on the front was familiar, steady, all capitals, pressed slightly into the page with care. She knew who it was from before she even opened it. She gathered the other nurses, Elsie, Clara and Anna, and together they sat, at the end of the tent near the open flap, where the breeze carried the scent of drying grass and distant pine trees. Margaret opened the letter slowly, the paper rustling softly as she unfolded it. Then, in a voice steady and gentle, she began to read. To the kind hands who helped me heal, I am writing from my mother's kitchen, where the window is open, and the breeze smells like bread and lilacs. I never thought I'd sit here again. Not really. But here I am, warm and safe, with clean clothes on my back and 2 strong feet beneath me. Margaret paused for a moment, her fingers brushing the edge of the letter. The others leaned in just slightly, listening, as if each word were a cup. Of warm tea, she continued. I don't remember everything from my time there, not every face, not every word, but I remember the feeling. I remember waking up and hearing your voices. I remember the way you fluffed my pillow before I even asked, and the way someone, I think it was Clara, brought me a flower in an old bottle and said, "Even in a tent, beauty belongs." Clara gave a little laugh, pressing her hand to her heart. I did say that. I remember warm water on my face and tea that tasted like home. I remember the way you read my sister's letters out loud, slowly, like each sentence mattered. And I remember the music box one of you wound up at night when the wind was high, and the tent felt too big. Elsie smiled, her eyes misting slightly. That was mine. The letter went on. I want you to know that I've healed more than just my body. I've healed something quieter, something inside. And it didn't come from stitches or medicine, it came from the way you tucked me in at night, the way you smiled when you passed my bed, the way no one ever rushed, even when there was so much to do. There's a kind of magic in what you do, a magic so gentle it doesn't even call itself magic. But I felt it. I carry that with me now. Margaret's voice slowed, softening with the next words. I'm helping my father on the farm again. My leg aches a little when the rain comes, but I can walk. I can work, I can laugh. I planted a row of tomatoes last week. My little sister, the one whose letters you read, says she wants to be a nurse now. She says, if nurses can bring someone home, that's the job she wants. Anna blinked rapidly and smiled. That's the best kind of reason, Margaret continued, her voice steady despite the emotion in her chest. I don't know how many of you are still there. Some faces, I remember clearly, some I don't. But this letter is for all of you. For every hand that folded a blanket, poured a cup of tea, or whispered a story to a half-asleep soldier. Thank you for giving me back more than just strength. Thank you for giving me back a sense of softness in the world. Yours with deep gratitude and quiet joy, Samuel Long. Margaret folded the letter gently, holding it in her lap as silence settled around them like a blanket. No one spoke right away. They just sat there, the breeze brushing past them, the sun warming their backs, the sound of distant birds filling the space where words might have been. Clara wiped her eyes and let out a breath. He always had kind eyes. Elsie nodded. He used to hum in his sleep, peaceful little tunes. Anna, who had joined the tent only after Samuel had gone, looked from face to face. I feel like I know him now. Margaret placed the letter in the wooden box where special things were. I kept it, thank you notes, tiny drawings, pressed flowers, things that reminded them why they did what they did, things that reminded them what quiet care could become. Outside the tent, the world continued softly, a bird calling from a treetop, a breeze moving through the grass, a kettle whistling, somewhere down the path. But inside the tent, everything felt just a little warmer. A letter had arrived, and in its words, they had all found a little more strength, a little more hope, and a gentle reminder that the smallest kindness can last far beyond the walls of a canvas tent. The sun had climbed gently over the tree line, casting soft gold across the canvas tents. The morning air was crisp, but not cold, and the earth still smelled faintly of rain from 2 nights before. It was the kind of day that asked for something slow, something quiet, something to grow. Margaret stood near the edge of the camp, her apron pockets filled with small paper envelopes. Each one held seeds, tiny, nearly weightless and full of promise. Over here, called Clara softly, already kneeling beside a narrow patch of earth near the back of the supply tent. The soil there was loose and dark, a bit rocky but welcoming enough. Elsie joined her carrying a little spade and 2 empty tin mugs that had been cleaned and repurposed for watering. Anna followed with a rolled-up bundle of string and short, wooden sticks to mark the rows. The nurses had spoken of this garden for days, just a tiny one tucked away in the quiet space between tents and trees. Not for food, not for any grand reason, just for beauty, for color, for life. Do you think they'll grow? Anna asked, settling on her knees beside the others. They'll try, Margaret said, kneeling down. And that's enough for now. They began to work slowly, pulling up tufts of grass and clearing away small stones. The soil was cool in their hands, crumbly and soft beneath their fingers. The rhythm of the work was soothing. Dig, scoop, smooth pat. No one rushed. There was no reason to. Above them, birds fluttered through the branches. One landed nearby, tilting its head curiously at the women working in silence. A small breeze lifted a curl from Margaret's forehead, and the scent of earth filled her lungs. She opened the first envelope and poured a few seeds into her palm, round and tiny, like specks of dust. "These are marigolds," she said. "My mother always said they were little suns," Elsie smiled. "Let's plant some sunshine then." They dug shallow trenches, just enough for the seeds to settle in, and gently placed them in the earth, one at a time, as though each was being tucked in for a nap. Next came the lavender seeds, smaller still, almost hard to see. Clara leaned in close as she dropped them into the soil. "These will take patience," she whispered, "but I think they'll come." Anna marked the rows with small sticks, tying twine between them. She wrote little notes on each one with a bit of charcoal, marigold, lavender, mint, chamomile. "We'll water them at sunrise," Margaret said, patting down the earth with her palms. "And maybe sing to them now and then." "Sing," Elsie laughed softly. "My grandmother used to hum while she gardened. Said the roots like the company," Clara chuckled. "Then we'll hum." After the planting, they poured water from the tin mugs, just enough to darken the soil and help it settle. Droplets beaded and rolled, soaking into the earth like a quiet blessing. The patch was small, barely longer than a single cot, no, wider than the stove inside the tent, but it felt big in its own way. Not in size, but in spirit. It was something living, something beginning, in a place where so much had been about healing what had already happened. Anna sat back on her heels and brushed dirt from her hands. "I think the soldiers will like it," Margaret nodded. "It will give them something to look at, something that changes with time." Clara added, "Something that says not everything is ending. Some things are still starting." They sat in silence for a moment, the garden between them. The soil was dark and slightly messy, with crooked lines and uneven patches. But it was theirs. It was real. It was growing. A breeze moved through the tents, lifting the canvas flaps and rustling the grass. A few leaves danced across the ground. Somewhere in the distance, the soft ring of a spoon in a teacup echoed like a bell. Margaret closed her eyes for a moment. She imagined the marigolds blooming, bright yellow and orange, lifting their faces to the sun. She pictured the lavender, stretching tall and fragrant, swaying in the breeze. She thought of a soldier sitting nearby holding a letter from home, glancing up and seeing color, seeing life. "Maybe we can plant more later," Anna said softly. "Roses or pansies." "One patch at a time," Margaret replied. "Even a single bloom changes the world around it." As they stood, brushing soil from their skirts, they looked once more at the tiny patch of garden. It was quiet, still. Nothing had sprouted yet, but already it felt like something had changed. The garden didn't fix everything. It didn't stop pain or erase memories, but it whispered something important. There is still life here. There is still beauty. There is still tomorrow. And for now, that was enough. The sun was just beginning to slip behind the tree line, casting long golden beams across the dusty ground. The air was warm but soft, and the scent of tea leaves, dry grass, and faint lavender hung gently in the breeze. The evening was quiet, not sleepy, not slow, just calm, like the whole camp had taken a long breath and was letting it out. Near the edge of the tents, under the low branches of a wide old tree, someone had brought out the gramophone. Clara had found it earlier that week, stored away in an old wooden crate near the supply shed, a bit dusty, slightly cracked, but still good. With some gentle cleaning and a bit of careful winding, the little machine had begun to hum again, quietly, sweetly, like it remembered music. Tonight, they decided to play it. Margaret placed the record on the turntable and set the needle down, slowly. A soft crackle filled the air, followed by the beginning notes of a waltz, slow, lilting, old-fashioned, the kind that wrapped around you instead of pulling you forward. The nurses gathered one by one, drawn by the sound, their footsteps, quiet in the dust. Clara stood off to one side, swaying slightly. Elsie clapped her hands once, just gently. "Oh, this one," she whispered. "It sounds like a porch in summer." Anna smiled. "It sounds like home." No one said, "Let's dance." They didn't have to. Margaret stepped toward Elsie and gave the smallest nod. Elsie took her hand, and the two of them began to move, slowly, softly. A step forward, a step to the side, a turn. Their skirts fluttered just slightly with each motion. The dust below their feet rose gently, catching the golden light and hanging in the air like mist. They danced the way people do when no one's watching. Not for show, not for skill, just for the joy of moving with the music. A few soldiers, sitting outside the recovery tent with cups of warm tea, looked on quietly, small smiles on their faces. One of them leaned back against the canvas and closed his eyes, listening. Anna joined next, pulling Clara gently into the space beside the tree. Their hands met, and they laughed softly at their awkward steps, but neither stopped. They turned, swayed, moved in small circles, the music filling the space between them. The gramophone played on. Its notes floated up into the dusk, carried by the wind like petals, and the nurses danced, just a few steps. Nothing elaborate. No flourishes or spins. But in those soft steps there was something rare. Freedom. For just a few minutes they weren't nurses or caretakers or tired hands folding linens. They were girls in a quiet meadow, moving with grace and lightness. Margaret's heart swelled. She hadn't danced in a long time. Not since before the war, not since those summer evenings in the village square when lanterns hung from trees, and someone always had a violin. But her feet remembered, her shoulders remembered, and most of all, her smile remembered. The soldiers continued to watch, some clapping gently along, others simply closing their eyes to let the melody drift. Through them, like a gentle wind, the light began to shift, dusk deepening into early night. Stars blinked quietly into view above the trees. The last rays of sunlight stretched across the field, touching the dancers' hair and shoulders like a blessing. When the song came to an end, the gramophone crackled once more, then fell silent. "No," one spoke at first. Then Clara bowed playfully to Anna and said, "We were a bit wobbly, but I dare say graceful." Anna laughed, like ducklings trying to be swans. Margaret and Elsie stepped back from the little open circle, cheeks flushed, eyes warm. Elsie patted her chest. "I'd forgotten how much a soft song can do." Margaret looked around, at the nurses, the soldiers, the little cloud of dust still settling back to the earth. "I think we all needed that," she said. They stood together in the growing twilight, quiet and content. The gramophone sat still on its crate, the record finished, the music lingering in memory. Someone brought out a kettle, and tea was passed around once again. Warm mugs held in tired hands, steam curling up into the cool evening air. The nurses sat on benches and overturned baskets, the edges of their skirts brushing the dust. A few of the soldiers nearby thanked them in quiet voices. One said, "You looked like poetry." Another whispered, "Felt like peace." Margaret looked down at her boots, lightly coated in the pale brown dust from the dancing. She smiled. It hadn't been much, a few minutes, a handful of steps, an old song, but it had reminded them all of something gentle, that even in the midst of worry there is still room for music. Even in a place built for healing wounds, hearts can still lift, and even in dusty fields, feet can still remember how to dance. The sun had barely begun its slow rise when Margaret stepped outside. The tent, her journal tucked beneath one arm and a folded cloth in her hand. The grass was damp with dew, and the light made every droplet shimmer like tiny stars scattered across the earth. The field behind the supply tent had bloomed again, small wildflowers, soft and quiet, peeking out through the tall grass. Some were yellow like butter, others blue like the morning sky, and a few were so pale pink they looked almost white in the early light. Margaret knelt down, letting the hem of her dress brush the grass, and looked closely at the flowers. She didn't pick them all. Only a few, only the ones that leaned just right or caught the light in a certain way. The kind of flowers that made her pause, made her breathe a little deeper. She placed each one gently on the cloth, wrapping them with care, like secrets, whispered into her hands. Back in the tent, the morning had begun to stir. Tea was brewing, water was warming, and the first soft greetings of the day were being exchanged in whispers. But Margaret moved quietly to the back corner where her things were kept. A little shelf, a chair, and her journal. The journal wasn't full of writing. Not really. Here and there she had jotted down a sentence or two, the name of a soldier she wanted to remember, a kind phrase someone had said, the way the sky had looked on a certain evening. But most of the pages were blank. Waiting. She opened to one of them now and laid the cloth beside her. Each flower she placed gently onto the page, smoothing the petals with the softest touch of her fingertip. She chose a tiny yellow bloom first, round and cheerful, and pressed it between two sheets of parchment paper she kept just for this. Then a sprig of lavender, small and fragrant, still carrying the scent of the garden patch they had planted. Then a blue petal from a flower Anna had tucked behind her ear the day before during a break in the shade. With each one, she closed the book slowly, folding the page shut like sealing away a soft moment in time. Clara passed by and paused when she saw her. "Saving treasures again?" she asked with a smile. Margaret looked up. "Only the quiet ones." Clara sat beside her and peeked at the flowers, still waiting to be pressed. "That one's from the garden patch, isn't it?" Margaret nodded. "It was leaning right toward the sunlight this morning." Clara gently touched the tip of one. "Petal. I used to press flowers as a girl," she whispered. "Between cookbooks mostly. Mama used to say she'd be baking a pie and find a daisy in the middle of the recipe." Margaret smiled. "That sounds just right." There was something about the act of pressing flowers, the way it asked for stillness, for attention, for gentleness. It made you stop. It made you notice not just the flowers, but the moment. Elsie joined them a few minutes later, holding 2 mugs of tea. She handed one to Margaret and took a seat on a folded blanket nearby. "More flowers for the memory book?" she asked. Margaret nodded again. "For the days we'll want to hold on to, the ones that feel like whispers." She turned a page in the journal, now thick with past pressings, faint imprints of petals and stems, some brittle, some still faintly colourful. Between the pages, stories lived that weren't written in words, like the time they danced under the tree, or when Samuel Long's letter had made everyone smile and cry at once, or the first day Anna had arrived and helped plant mint beside the tent. Each flower had its own silence, its own memory, and the journal held them all. As the day went on, Margaret added a few more, a single white clover, a violet that had grown near the washstand, and one crumpled petal from a bloom a soldier had dropped while writing a letter. Later, that afternoon, as the sun tilted lower, she placed a soft brown leaf, not a flower but one that had fallen from the tree under which they sometimes sat for tea. "It's part of the story too," she said. Elsie agreed. "Even the quiet endings belong." By the end of the day, the journal had grown just a little heavier, not much, but enough to carry the weight of small joys, gentle colors, and soft memories. Margaret tied a piece of ribbon around it, not tightly, just enough to keep it closed, to let the flowers rest undisturbed. She placed it back on the shelf beside the folded letters, the tin of lavender balm, and the extra bottle of ink. And for a long moment, she stood there, looking at it, not because it was beautiful, but because it reminded her that beauty was worth remembering, even when days were long, even when things were hard, even when everything moved slowly and softly. Or maybe because of that. The pressed flowers would stay. They wouldn't bloom again, not in the way they had, but they would remain held safely between pages, whispering stories to anyone who took the time to stop and open them. It was a clear, gentle morning, the kind that made everything feel fresh and full of light. The sky was soft blue, dotted with a few slow-moving clouds, and the trees swayed just enough to rustle their branches like a quiet yawn. It was laundry day at the recovery tent. Margaret stood near the wooden wash basin, sleeves rolled neatly above, her elbows, a pale apron tied snug around her waist. The scent of soap and sun-warmed cloth filled the air, light and clean. Around her, baskets of linen were stacked in careful piles, folded, unfolded, washed and waiting. A kettle of water bubbled gently over the fire nearby, sending up faint steam as Elsie added a handful of fresh lavender to the rinse. The scent drifted up and out with the breeze curling into the sky. Perfect day for drying, Elsie said, adjusting the line between two trees. Margaret nodded, smiling. The sun's warm but not too hot. It'll kiss the sheets dry. Anna approached, carrying a bundle of damp towels. They already smell better, she said, setting them down beside the line. Even the wind is soft today. The nurses worked slowly, folding and unfolding, rinsing and wringing, their hands moving in rhythm, not rushed, not mechanical, just steady and kind. Nearby, several long lines had been stretched between poles and trees, forming a little lane of linen. One by one, they began to pin the sheets to the lines, their arms reaching up, their skirts brushing against the grass. The sheets caught the wind like sails. They fluttered gently, then settled. The sun shone through them like a soft lantern, glowing, not bright. As the cloth swayed, shadows played across it, the flicker of leaves, the outline of a bird flying overhead, the hand of a nurse adjusting a fold. A soldier resting nearby watched from the shade, his eyes following the dancing linens. "Looks like clouds," he whispered, "hung out to dry." Margaret smiled when she heard him. "There'll be folded clouds by evening." She carried another piece to the line, a blanket slightly heavier, and shook it out slowly. Dust rose and caught the light like glitter in the air. Then she clipped it gently in place, smoothing it with the palm of her hand. Elsie and Clara began hanging pillowcases in pairs, their laughter soft and breezy. "I remember helping my mother do this," Clara said. "She used to hum while we worked, said the linens dried faster that way." Elsie hummed a little tune as she pinned. "Worth a try." The notes floated through the warm air, gentle and familiar, the kind of tune no one really knew but everyone recognized in their bones. As the day passed, the laundry lines filled. Rows of sheets, towels, and pillowcases swayed gently in the sunlight, a small moving wall of white and cream and pale blue. It created a quiet maze between the trees, a hidden place full of fluttering light and dappled shadows. Anna stepped between the lines, running her fingers along the fabric, letting it brush against her shoulders and cheeks like a soft curtain. "It's like walking through a dream," she said softly. Margaret joined her, ducking under a freshly washed sheet. The world inside the lines was peaceful, wind whispering, fabric swaying, light glowing through cotton. They walked slowly, taking their time, the linen walls around them rustling gently with each step. Beyond the lines, a few more soldiers had gathered in the sunlight, watching with calm eyes. One dozed lightly, head resting on a rolled-up coat. Another sat sketching the lines of the laundry in a small notebook, his pencil moving slowly. The laundry became more than laundry. It became a moment, a reminder that life, even here, could be clean and simple and beautiful. Margaret returned to the wash basin to wring out the final cloths. Her hands were damp and slightly red from the soap, but her movements were slow and sure. She rinsed the last piece, folded it gently and set it on the basket beside her. Then she dipped her hands into a clean bowl of lavender water, letting them rest in the warmth for a moment before drying them on her apron. The wind picked up just a little, tugging at the corners of the hanging linens, making them sway in unison. The sunlight shimmered through the cloth like candlelight in a chapel. Later in the afternoon, as the breeze grew warmer, the nurses began taking down the dry sheets. They folded each one slowly, smoothing the edges, stacking them in neat piles. The scent of sun and soap clung to every fold. "This one's still warm," Anna said, holding a blanket to her chest. "Like it remembers the sun." Margaret smiled. "That's how it should be." They carried the clean laundry back to the tent, arms full of sunlight and quiet joy, and placed it in the fresh linen cupboard, ready for the next round of beds of comfort, of soft rest. The lines outside slowly emptied and the breeze faded to a hush. By evening, all that was left was the scent of lavender in the air and a sky slowly turning pink, and the memory of cloth dancing in the wind. The sky was changing, that slow and gentle shift from gold to rose to violet. The sun had almost dipped below the horizon, leaving behind a soft glow that painted the edges of the tents and trees in warm light. Inside the recovery tent, the evening was winding down. Blankets were tucked, candles were lit, and the hush of bedtime had begun to settle. Outside, the birds had gone quiet, and the breeze had grown cooler, like a whisper bidding the day goodbye. Margaret sat alone at the small wooden desk near the back of the tent. A candle flickered beside her, its light soft and golden. Her journal lay open in front of her, the same one where she had once pressed flowers, tucked notes, and scribbled thoughts between shifts. She dipped her pen in the ink pot and held it above the page for a moment, listening to the sounds around her, a breath, a rustle of linen, the gentle creak of a stool. And then, in the stillness, she began to write. Dusk again. The light moves across the tent like a wave pulling back to sea. It's the time of day I love. The most. Everything soft, everything slower, everything honest. Her handwriting was slow and rounded, the kind that came from tired but steady hands. She didn't rush. Each word landed like a small stone placed in water, sending out quiet ripples. Today felt like a warm page, laundry flapping on the line, tea that tasted just right. Samuel, the young one in the corner bed, smiled in his sleep. A real smile. He hadn't done that in days. She paused, listening again. The soldiers were resting now, some asleep, others quietly watching the shadows dance on the canvas walls. In one corner, Elsie sat mending a torn sleeve, humming a tune too low to recognize. Anna and Clara had gone to fetch more candles for the night. Margaret looked back down at the page. Anna is learning quickly. She asks before she acts. She listens, more than she speaks. I think she understands. This work isn't just about doing, it's about being present. About noticing the tiny things that hold people together when they feel like they're falling apart. She dipped the pen again, gently blowing on the ink as she went. I saw Clara pressing a fresh flower into her own journal today. She didn't say anything. She just looked at it for a long time, like it had said something to her. Maybe it had. The candle beside her flickered, the flame leaning sideways before returning to its calm stand. Margaret looked toward the flap of the tent. Outside, the first star had appeared, twinkling just above the tree line. A soldier's voice murmured in sleep, and another shifted beneath his blanket. There is strength in these moments. Not loud. Strength. Not the kind they write medals for, but quiet strength. The kind found in holding a hand, in changing a bandage with care, in tucking someone in and whispering, "You're safe now." She looked down at her hand, the one holding the pen. It had become steadier over the months, not because it had learned to move quickly, but because it had learned when to pause, when to rest, when to simply be still. I used to think I had to fix everything, every pain, every fear, but now I know healing isn't always about curing. Sometimes it's about being with someone in their hardest moment, not fixing it, just being there. And that matters more than I ever imagined. She turned the page and began again, slower now, letting each word settle. Samuel will likely leave next week. He asked today if he should feel guilty for surviving. I told him no, feel grateful, feel humble, and then go grow something with that second chance. A tree, a garden, a life. The tip of her pen paused on the page, then moved again. The garden. Near the tent is growing. Tiny leaves, barely visible unless you kneel down. But they're there, they're trying. I suppose that's all any of us can do. Try and grow, even in hard soil. Elsie passed by and smiled softly, placing a fresh cup of warm tea beside her. Margaret whispered a thank you, then returned to the page. The scent of lavender is fading from the tent, but the feeling it gave us is still here, like a breath that lingers long after a song ends. She leaned back in her chair, staring at the ink drying on the page. Her hand rested on the open journal, as if to press the memory into place. In the quiet around her, the flame of the candle burned low, and the dusk outside melted into the deep blue of night. She closed the journal gently, wrapped it in a soft cloth, and placed it in the drawer where the pressed flowers and folded letters were kept, a keepsake of the quiet moments, of the people, of the silent strength that moved through the tent every single day, not as a roar, but as a whisper. And as she stood and blew out the candle, the glow faded softly, but the warmth remained. Evening had once again settled over the recovery tent, soft and still, like a warm blanket. The lanterns flickered gently, casting quiet, halos of golden light across the canvas walls. Outside, the breeze had slowed, and the first stars had begun to appear, quiet, steady, and familiar. Inside, everything was calm. The beds were straightened, fresh linens tucked with care. Tea, cups had been emptied, blankets adjusted, pillows fluffed. Most of the soldiers were already resting, their faces peaceful, their breathing slow. Margaret walked the center aisle, her hands folded gently in front of her, pausing now and then just to listen. Not for alarms, not for instructions, just to hear the quiet sound of rest. The reward of a day well cared for. As she reached the far end of the tent, a voice whispered, "Thank you." It came from the corner bed, a soldier who had barely spoken in days. His eyes were open now, glinting softly in the candlelight. His voice was thin, but certain. Margaret turned and walked over. She knelt beside him and offered a small smile. "You're very welcome." He didn't say anything else, just nodded, then closed his eyes, but something in the way he said it stayed with her. On her way back toward the center of the tent, another voice rose, barely louder than the breeze. "Outside, thanks for the tea." It came from Samuel, who'd had a difficult morning but had finally settled after his evening walk. Margaret smiled again. "Of course." "Felt like home," he added softly. Nearby, Clara adjusted a curtain and was turning to leave when a hand reached out from a cot and lightly touched her sleeve. "Thank you for helping me sit up earlier," the soldier said. His voice was shy, as though unused to expressing emotion aloud. Clara placed her hand gently on his shoulder. It was nothing. But it wasn't. None of it was. Anna carrying a fresh towel too. The washstand paused when another soldier murmured, "Thank you for not forgetting my name." She turned toward him, surprised by the softness of the moment. He wasn't even looking at her, just staring at the tent ceiling. But the words were real, and they mattered. "I remember every name," she whispered back, and she did. As the hour passed, the tent seemed to hum with quiet thanks. Some were whispered, some were mouthed without sound. Some came in the form of a nod, a blink, or a hand briefly placed over a nurse's own. There was no ceremony, no announcements, just small moments of gratitude, drifting through the room like candlelight. Margaret returned to her desk, where her journal still lay from earlier, and looked around. Clara tucked a blanket under a sleeping man's chin. Elsie wiped the edge of a bedside table with a damp cloth, smoothing away the dust. Anna folded a towel one last time and placed it in the linen shelf. Everything was still. Everything was kind, and the words "thank you" seemed to echo between the beds, not in volume but in feeling. They weren't just for the nurses. They were for the quiet, for the care, for the way the tent had become more than a place for healing. It had become a shelter for hearts. A soldier, still half awake, looked over at Margaret and said softly, "Thank you for being gentle." She blinked, smiled, and walked over to his bed. "I didn't know how to be anything else," she whispered. He nodded, and that was enough. At the far end, another patient, one who had come in only 3 days earlier and barely spoken since, raised his hand weakly when Clara passed. She leaned down, expecting a question, but he simply whispered, "Thank you for your stories." Clara touched his blanket. "Would you like another tomorrow?" His eyes closed. "Yes, please." Outside, the stars brightened. Inside, the room glowed not with electricity or fire, but with gratitude.